Hey there, welcome back to Bedtime Chills. Tonight, we're bringing you a mix of spine-tingling horror stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. New viewers, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Let's dive into these eerie tales together. Something horrible arrived with the rain. I'm visiting my brother's cabin in Washington State. He let me come here after my divorce to get away from all the nonsense and clear my head for a couple of weeks. It's beautiful out here, the quaint little hut exactly what I had been expecting. It's surrounded by dense forest, and you have to take a long dirt road to reach it. It's wonderful. Before I arrived, my brother informed me that he had stocked the hut with groceries, enough to last a month if I decided to stay that long. He was leaving it up to me, knowing what hell my breakup had been. I had lost almost everything, and as a gesture of goodwill, he extended a hand and offered his cabin to me. It was a welcome sanctuary, and upon arrival, I found myself blissfully calm. The woods were alive with sound, the creak of wood, the gentle rustle of wine through the leaves, the chirp of birds in conversation. It was all so serene. The first couple of days were wonderful, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. The horrible legal battle I had been engaged in with my wife had taken the wind out of my sails, but out here, I let the warm breeze envelop me with new life and energy. To my surprise, it had been beautiful the first couple of days, with gentle golden rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy of green overhead. The first 3 days, I spent a lot of time walking through the woods, isolated from everything and everyone. I was alone out here, a stranger to the surrounding green kingdom. I let my mind wander free from the chains it had been bound with, my thoughts drifting towards what I would do with my new life. Possibilities began to blossom before me, and I actually started discovering hope in my future again. But then the rain came. I had heard on the news that a 7-day storm was headed my way, so it came as no surprise when the sky darkened. As a resident of Washington, I was no stranger to long bouts of rain, and this was no different. I had just finished eating dinner when the rain started, gentle pitter-patters on the roof that eventually evolved into a full-blown gale. I started a fire and pulled a chair up to the window, watching the storm. It was cozy, and I found peace in watching the chaos that I was protected from. And then, I heard something on the roof. I cocked my ear to listen, the small cabin lit only by the glow of the fireplace. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but after a few moments, I realized it sounded like someone was running around up there. I didn't know what to make of it, assuming it had to be some kind of animal, but it sounded much bigger. I grabbed the blanket off of the chair I was sitting in and pulled it up to my chin, creeped out by the noise. After a little bit, the sound stopped. My heart was in my throat, and my eyes darted to the front door. Thunder boomed overhead, and I suddenly felt incredibly far away from civilization. I shivered despite the fire and turned my eyes to look out the window I was sitting in front of. Lightning flashed, and I suddenly leaned forward, heart racing. Something wasn't right out there. I thought my eyes had to be playing tricks on me, and I anxiously waited for more lightning. I forced myself to calm down, sure that what I had just seen was paranoia brought on by fear. The world was illuminated once again by a bright blast of lightning, and my eyes went wide. Mere feet from the window, the rain seemed to bend around the shapes of 3 invisible figures. They stood about 6 feet tall, the rain outlining their still forms. I swallowed hard, waiting for another blast of lightning, and when it came, the shapes remained. They were immobile, and I suddenly felt eyes on me, as if they had come with the storm to watch me. I retreated from the window, feeling exposed and afraid, and went and sat on my bed. I was terrified, so shaken by the bizarre forms that I began to have a hard time breathing. I took a few long, deep pulls of air, willing myself to settle down. As my heart rate slowed, I started convincing myself that I had imagined the shapes. Between the rain and the dark, it was easy to mistake shadows and shapes that weren't actually there. Just as I was about to get back up, I heard something walking on the roof again. I gripped the sides of my bed as I listened to the heavy footsteps walk closer and then finally stop directly over my head. I crawled between my covers and held my breath, eyes wide in a panic. What in the world was out there? Another flash of lightning lit the sky, and I glanced at the window. It was right there, its invisible form parting the rain like a curtain. It was watching me. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the covers over my head. I heard myself whimpering and slapped a hand over my mouth. What were these things? What did they want? And then a thought slammed into me with the force of a locomotive. Where was the third one? And that's when I heard the front door crash open. I cried out in fear, shaking like a child as heavy, with footsteps walked across the cabin towards me. It stopped by the side of my bed, and I felt drops of water falling from its body onto my blanket. I could hear it breathing, a sucking sound pulled deep into its moist lungs. As I balled up under the covers, terrified, it spoke. "Look at me." Its voice sounded like rain, an odd, stuttered inflection of its vocal cords. I didn't move, didn't breathe, praying that this nightmare would end. I didn't know what these things were or what they wanted, but I sensed danger. I sensed they wanted to hurt me. And I sensed that if I looked at them, they could. I stayed balled up under my blankets and kept my trembling mouth shut. "Look at me," it repeated in the same wet voice, its words dribbling from its mouth like running water. Again, I didn't move. I was absolutely paralyzed with fear. I kept my eyes closed and the blanket firmly over me. My stomach churned with terror, and my breath was hot in the enclosed space. I don't know how long I waited. Eventually, I heard the thing retreat, slamming the door behind it. Even with it gone, I remained where I was, refusing to move. I listened to the rain crash down above me, the relentless storm never ceasing in its violence. I don't know if I fell asleep or passed out, but the next thing I remember was opening my eyes to dim gray light. I hesitantly pulled the blanket from me and surveyed the cabin. The fire had died out, and the scene before me was still in the early morning light. The rain still thundered overhead as sheets of it were driven from the dark sky. I slowly got out of bed and went to the window. "Please," I muttered, voice cracking. The three figures stared back at me, the rain outlining their still figures. I dropped to the floor, out of sight, a hand to my chest. I crawled over to the small kitchen and reached up to retrieve my cell phone. It wasn't there. I jumped to my feet, scouring the surface for where I knew I had left it the previous night. It was gone, but a long, wet, dark smudge stained the wood, starting at the center and running to the edge. That thing had taken my phone. I was trapped. "What do you want from me?" I screamed. "What do you want from me?" The storm offered me no answer. "Leave me alone," I whispered. "Just leave me alone, please." It's been 3 weeks. The storm hasn't ceased. I don't know what's happened. Something is seriously wrong. The sky remains a dim gray, the day-night cycle stuck in some horrific limbo. I don't think I'm ever getting out of this cabin. I'm almost out of food, and I wonder how long I can last before starvation drives me outside these walls. They're still there, the endless rain painting their figures in the air. They watch, always, they watch. When I hear one of them running across the roof, I sprint to my bed and bury myself under the covers. As soon as I do, another slams the front door open and comes to stand over me. It tells me to look at it, commands me to look at it. I can't, I won't. Something about its voice has begun to sound familiar. The more it speaks to me, the more I have begun to recognize it. It sounds like me. And last night, When one of them was standing over my bed, it said something different. It told me that things should have been different. It told me it was disappointed in the way my life had turned out. It told me I needed to acknowledge my mistakes. It told me it was time to let another one of them try. Plot holes. The day I found my first hole was the day my best friend came back from the dead. We were in high school and being reckless. Jake was his name, and we liked to go out to this old, abandoned house in the woods after school to just mess around. Do stupid teenage things. It was a pretty big place, to be honest. A 2-story house with a basement, or 3 stories if you counted the small attic above it. The story goes that an old woman was building the house years ago to get away from city life, but for some reason, never finished it. Probably died. Anyway, the house was pretty close to completion when she stopped, but nobody bothered to finish it, and now it just sits there rotting away. So Jake and I would go to the house and just mess around, scaring each other or exploring the place, whatever we felt like. Usually, we were careful or lucky, but nothing ever happened to make us worry. Then the floorboards broke under Jake's feet when we were exploring the 2nd floor, and he fell. I never realized how bad the condition of the house must have been because when he hit the 1st floor, that broke too, and he fell into the basement. I ran down and looked through the broken hole in the 1st floor. It was dark, but we usually had the foresight to bring flashlights, so I shined a light on him. I'll never forget what I saw. One of the boards or something must have fallen at just the right angle that when Jake hit the ground, it speared up right through his stomach. I could see him shift and try to grab at it. Even hear him gurgle, and then he stopped. He was dead. I was sure of it. Our recklessness got him killed. I was in shock. I didn't know what to do. So I just ran. I ran out of the house and left him there. It was about evening when I got home, and I went straight to my room. I didn't talk to anyone. Didn't stop for anything. I just wanted to curl up and try to forget that scene. My parents tried to talk to me, but I feigned sleep, and they just went on. Later that night, we got a call from Jake's parents asking where he was. They actually woke me up for that one, and I said I had no idea. The usual, well, if you see him, please let us know, came afterward, and I just nodded before I went back to sleep. The next day was school, and I went through the morning ritual in a bit of a trance. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't stay home. I was pretty sure Jake's parents already suspected something of me. So I went. School was just like usual. People messing around in the morning and talking. I went up to my normal group of friends that I hung out with before the first bell rang, and my heart stopped. There was Jake. He stood there, just laughing and being his normal self. When he saw me, he looked over and grinned before coming over. He made a joke, but I didn't hear it. I just continued to stare. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, starting to get concerned. "Aren't you? Are you okay?" was all I could muster back. "Well, yeah. Why wouldn't I be?" He laughed a bit, but gave me a weird look. You don't know anything?" I tried to phrase it as delicately as possible. I didn't want anyone else knowing, but I figured that was enough to clue him in. If it did, he didn't show it. "Know anything of what?" he responded, and then the bell rang. He said bye and gave me a weird look before heading off to class. I just stared after him in shock. Why was my friend here? I saw him die. At the very least, he should be in the hospital. But he was fine. I went to class, but I couldn't concentrate. I just kept thinking about Jake and how he should be dead. I kept trying to think of how he could have survived, but I just couldn't fill this strange hole of a mystery. After class, I decided I'd check out the house. Jake met me after school and asked if I still wanted to hang out. I told him I wasn't feeling well and we'd catch up tomorrow. He seemed to accept that and move off. It's not like I wasn't excited my friend was back, but looking at him made something in me cringe. He shouldn't be alive. He should not be here. I saw him. So I went to the house that afternoon alone. When I walked in, I could feel something. It was strange but familiar. It was the same feeling I got when I looked at Jake. That something wasn't right, and it was just off. However, here, it felt like a lingering feeling. Not this fresh, what the heck? I got when I saw my friend. I stepped forward and looked down. Sure enough, there was the darn hole he fell through. I let out a sigh of relief and bent over. So I wasn't crazy. I slipped out my usual flashlight and shone it down into the hole. Yes. There was the wreck I saw him land on. Just no Jake. Did he get free? Did he magically regenerate or something? I shone my flashlight up to look toward the hole on the second floor. It wasn't there. My breath caught in my throat, and I began to frantically shine my light onto the ceiling. Where was it? I should be right above the darn hole in the floor. But nothing. I bolted up the stairs, and sure enough, there was nothing in the floor where he fell. Nothing. Something was wrong. Really wrong. I wandered back down to the first hole and peeked down into it. I'm sure that was the moment that solidified my fate. If I had just ignored it, moved on, and been plain happy that my friend was back, I might have been able to continue life as usual. But that moment, I saw something. Just a flash of something black, blacker than the darkness beyond my flashlight's range shift and fly out of sight. I gasped and stumbled back, breathing heavily. I know I should have run, but my curiosity took hold. And my logical side said it was just some animal or trick of the light. So I swallowed my fear and leaned over to peek again. I didn't see that flash of black again, but I did notice something. The boards and wreckage underneath the hole were gone. With that note, I knew something was wrong. Nobody can clean up something like that mess in the blink of an eye. I bolted. I ran out of that house and through the forest, swearing up and down that something was chasing me. I had a feeling that there was something out there, but now I know it was simply watching me. For now. I ran home and slammed the door shut behind me before I leapt into my bed. My body curled up, and I just lay there, trying to comprehend what was going on. It took me a while, but I finally drew myself out of bed. I had to figure out what was going on, but like heck, I was going back to that darn house. Not if some monster was in it. So, I did what any teenager would do. I went to the internet and researched. It was slow, and I didn't have a lot of luck at first. Looking up paranormal just got me weird pictures and stories. Friend Comes Back from Dead got me a lot of zombie stuff. Missing Time seemed to give me a little more info. A lot of it was around aliens, but a few stories seemed to pique my interest. Like something crazy seeming to happen, like a car crash or accident, and suddenly there's a time jump and things seem to be okay. Like nothing ever happened. There was one post on a Missing Time board that seemed to draw my attention, however. It was titled Plot Holes and was only posted a couple of days ago. I curiously clicked it. Everyone seemed to speculate what caused this whole missing time thing. A lot of the time it was aliens or dimensional, whatever. This guy, however, acted like he knew for a fact. And his reason was the most bizarre of them all. He started by telling a similar story. In a nutshell, his wife was killed in a household accident when part of their house caved in during a storm. While trying to get to her, he was knocked out by some other debris. When he came to, he was sitting in the living room, and his wife was trying to wake him up. The house was fine, with no sign of disaster, and she was alive. He was ecstatic, but described a strange feeling. Like he had figured out something he shouldn't have, and that his wife shouldn't be there. Like my feeling I got with Jake. Over time, he couldn't be around her. It just was too strange. So he left. He went on the road, taking what money he had and doing weird little jobs here and there while staying in motels. While he went, he began to research. It took a great amount of time, but he found others with similar experiences. Most of them just described it as a miracle and moved on with their lives. Others couldn't shake the feeling, like he did. All of them described the same sort of thing. Some event should have caused something to happen, a person to die or some landmark to be destroyed, only to have it miraculously come back later. So what was going on? The author was at a standstill until he came across something. While researching people who shouldn't be alive, he came across a book review. Apparently, it was the latest book in the series, and in it, a side character saves the day by fighting off a bunch of enemies for the heroes. However, in the previous book, by a different author, that character had been killed. So, this character couldn't have come back to save the day, but if he didn't, the main characters would have died. The reviewer said it was one of the worst plot holes he ever seen. That got the forum author, and me, thinking. He said he'd post again after he experimented a bit, and I didn't blame him. I had a few things I wanted to experiment with as well. Nevertheless, I dropped him a message saying I read his post and that something similar happened to me. Then called it a night early. I had to be extremely alert if I was going to try to look for the signs I wanted to find. The next morning, I woke up and started my first attempt at looking for plot holes. I know how crazy that sounded, but something seemed to click after reading that review. Someone should have died, but that was ignored so he could do something of significance later. It sounded so familiar. The first few days, I didn't notice anything except for that weird feeling around Jake. Nobody else seemed to have it. The third day was when I noticed my first plot hole. It was minor. The most minor of details, but it was there. One of the girls in my class went from wearing a skirt to a set of jeans between periods. I know how that seems to make me look, but I'll admit it, the skirt was why I noticed. But to change into a pair of jeans within 7 minutes while walking across campus to another class? That doesn't make sense. I guessed it was possible, but it didn't make sense. It was like a costume got wrong during a scene change. After that, it went all downhill. I kept seeing changes everywhere. A sign would be black in the morning, but light green later at night, or a friend would go from wearing a sweater to a t-shirt when I looked away from a moment. You'd think that people would notice these changes, but nobody did. Maybe it was the strange feeling that I got of something being off after the accident with Jake, or perhaps you just had to be looking for them. But as I kept looking, they were everywhere. It was about a week and a half before I got a response back from the plot hole's author. He introduced himself as Dennis and apologized for being late to respond. His reason why? He had gotten caught up in observing plot holes. He was noticing the same thing I was. This is the first time I've ever actually spoken to this guy, but the changes he described match mine to a T. Except for one thing. After noticing a misspelled sign above a store late at night, he turned away for a moment to look back and saw a shadowy black figure floating by it. It was hazy, like looking at the figure through a fog that just wasn't there, but after the being floated away, the spelling error was gone. A shiver went down my spine. That seemed too close to whatever I might have glimpsed at the house. I hadn't seen it full on yet, but then now I knew what I was looking for. I wish I hadn't. It wasn't long before I began to see them. You had to look at just the right moment, I found out. When it seemed like nobody was watching or paying attention to that little error you just noticed. Then you could make it out. A shadowy haze of a being, seeming to be dressed in a long black robe with a hood, messing with it until it changed. I saw one fade my friend's t-shirt into a jacket/shirt set on a cold day in class. And I saw another change an entire stack of books at the library into a completely different set before they were picked up by a student. Nobody noticed them, just like the holes. It was like you had to be on that wavelength to notice. I'd been conversing with Dennis a bit online, and he agreed with that idea. It seemed that you had to notice one to start seeing the others. If you could brush it off, then your life would go on. But if you were the curious sort, then you were like the two of us. You'd just keep seeing them all the time. I was starting to go crazy. I couldn't say anything to anyone, and Jake kept bothering me about why we never hung out anymore. I just couldn't look at him. He wasn't natural, but I realized it wasn't him. It was those things that brought him back. Maybe he had some destiny or something, but I had no idea. Things took another turn while I was having a Skype conversation with Dennis. He asked if they noticed me yet. I told him no, and then he got quiet for a long time. After some bugging, he finally responded and told me one of his friends that was helping him look into this occurrence was gone. Nobody even seemed to remember his existence. When he went over to his friend's house, Dennis found it relatively neat save for a few items strewn about. As he explored, the belongings that were out of place began to find themselves back in their positions. Dennis was sure that it was one of those creatures behind it, and he confirmed his suspicions when he saw one putting back a book that had been thrown on the floor, and then turn and look at him. The two stared for a long time, the creature gazing onto Dennis while he looked into a blank nothingness that was its face, the dark hood covering whatever might have lurked underneath. And then, it left. It turned and seemed to float away right through one of the walls. That seemed to be the last thing out of place then. The house looked like nothing had ever happened in it. Then Dennis began to notice something else. There were no pictures or objects identifying an owner. Unless you were that much of a hermit, you had, at least, an old family picture of some parents or something. Or maybe some mail with your name on it. But nothing. It was like nobody had ever lived in this fully furnished home. At this point, I began to worry. Dennis's friend had gone missing, and nobody knew of his existence. I started putting the pieces together then. If these creatures could bring someone back from the dead, they could easily get rid of someone, right? This meant I was in danger. After that, I stopped. I was out. I ignored Dennis's messages. I tried to ignore all the holes I constantly noticed. I did my best to ignore those shadow creatures when I caught them. I even tried to hang back out with Jake. But every time we hung together, it was like I was looking at the face of a lie. And looking at him just made me think of those creatures. I imagined one pulling him up from that debris, slipping that board through at his body, knitting up his wounds like nothing happened. I did my best to look past it all. Dennis was hard to ignore, however. He just kept tracking me down. I'd block him from my email and messengers, but he'd start making new accounts to talk to send me more messages. And he seemed to be sending more and more as the days went on. Finally, one day, I received an email from a new account that clearly was Dennis. I was about to delete it and block him again, but the subject chilled me to the bone. They're after me. Get on Skype. I need help. I didn't know what to do. If Dennis was in trouble from these things, then I had to help. I couldn't just leave him. But after him, they might turn their sights on me. I had to help. I wasn't going to just leave him hanging, especially if he was in danger. I logged onto Skype, added his new account, and immediately got a video chat request. Dennis was in his apartment with the lights off, and he looked terrified. "What's going on?" I asked as I leaned in. They've been following me around, he spoke, his voice an exasperated whisper. More and more of them keep coming around. And not just to fill in the holes. They're watching me. Are you sure? In response, he lifts up his laptop and carried it out to what looked to be the kitchen. He set it down in front of a window and drew back the curtain. I couldn't make out anything until he turned on the light. My heart stopped. I'd only seen one of them at a time. Maybe even two if something was a particularly big change. But there were at least 3 or 4 behind that window, just staring in with those empty, hooded faces. He quickly flicked off the light and turned the laptop back toward him. Do you see? I don't know what to do. I don't want to end up like Jerry. Tell me what to do. He was getting more and more anxious. I had no idea what to tell him. I didn't know what these things were. I didn't know what they wanted, or how to stop them. I opened my mouth but couldn't form the words that he needed to hear. And as I stammered to find out what to say, I saw them slip into the background behind him. Through a wall. With a cabinet. Dennis. I yelled. Behind you. He turned just as the first approached. God, there were a bunch slipping in now. 3, then 4, then 5. He never stood a chance. The first reached forward with an inky arm and shoved it straight through his chest. There wasn't any blood, or even a sound saves for Dennis's terrified scream. He began to writhe, grasping at his chest as the creature held him thereby. I don't even know what. His spine? His heart? Heck, it could have been his very soul for all I know. Then the others were on top of him. They fell onto him like a dark dog pile, consuming him in their dark presences. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. I just watched as he faded from view as those creatures piled onto him. Then, slowly, ever so slowly, they backed away. Dennis was gone. I bit back tears as I saw the empty space he had been in. I knew what had happened. He was gone. Erased. Nobody would even remember him. He was a hole that had to be filled in and taken care of. Then their attention turned to the computer. To me. My eyes widened as realization hit me. I was another hole. I was an issue in their grand scheme. A thorn that had to be plucked. A part that drew attention to the inaccuracies of this world they were trying to design. And I had to be taken care of. I didn't even bother to turn off the computer. I just stood and turned only to find myself face to face with a horde of them. In my own house. In my own room. My back went to my desk as one shadowy shape glided to me. Its arm rose and I could almost make out the tendrils of its foggy black cloak and the individual digits of its dark fingers. I couldn't move. I was frozen. And then it struck. I didn't physically feel the hand shove into my chest, but I felt it somewhere deeper, like it was grabbing an intimate part of my being. I felt violated, exposed, and most of all, completely terrified. I screamed as it began to squeeze. It hurt. It hurt so very much. My vision blurred, but I could see the others move around me. They filled in a circle around my body, regardless if there was something in their way or not. They just glided through like those things weren't there. And then they fell upon me. Black hit me from every side. I screamed, but no sound came out. I could feel that hand wrenching back, pulling something so personal to me away. My body felt limp then. I started to feel nothing. It inched along my limbs, slowly turning feeling of cold, pain, terror into absolute nothingness. I could only describe it as a feeling of being erased. There was feeling, strong feeling, and then nothing. It slowly inched along, riding up along my arms and legs until it consumed my whole being. The pain faded along with it, along with the sounds of the world and my vision before me. Soon, nothing was before me but pure blackness. I was gone. I knew it. I was dead. Or worse. I didn't exist any longer. Stretched out before me was nothing but darkness. I tried to call out into the void, to claw my way forward, but I couldn't move a limb. More like, though, I didn't have a limb to move or a mouth to yell. I was just an essence. A leftover floating in an endless void of nothing. I'm still there. In pure nothingness. I can't move where I don't think I have anything left to move. It's gone. Every part of me is gone. I wonder what happens now. I wonder what Jake's destiny was. I also began to wonder if this was death or something worse. A punishment for sticking my nose in places it shouldn't be. Is this death or pure erasure? I'm sure Dennis is feeling the same things I'm feeling. I can almost imagine him too, floating in the same void. Maybe one day we'll meet each other. It's a hope that I try to keep alive. It keeps me saying that I might, one day, not be alone here. That's the end of my story. I wish it was better. I wish I could say I fought back and saved myself. At least, that I was on the run. But some plots don't have happy endings. However, I'm sure I've left you wondering one final thing. If I'm dead or erased, then how could I have written this? Well, my poor friend, you've just discovered your first plot hole. Be wary if you see any more. Every elementary school has a ridiculous urban legend. My school had Muppet Man, and I despised him. Muppet Man was deformed. Unfortunate plastic surgery left him with the ghastly proportions of a marionette puppet, so he stole a rainbow animal costume from the school theater and wore it everywhere. He lived in an ancient oak tree in the recess yard. Some kids claimed he lived in the branches, watching us play from camouflage hideouts of leaves and twigs. The grim kids said he lived in the trunk, eating caterpillar larvae and tormenting the ghost of Jason Hughes. Jason Hughes wasn't an urban legend, unfortunately. He was just a tragedy. A doomed, anxious wreck cursed with ridiculously oversized glasses and an obsession with drawing. I remember feeling angry one rainy afternoon because I wanted to color with the teacher's new markers, but Jason already used all the paper in the classroom. Nobody liked him much, including me. But I don't know why. He was a sweet kid. Fretful, anxious, and a little too smart for his own good, but sweet. Jason disappeared on a November evening in 2nd grade. A few days later, a teacher found his clothes piled at the base of the schoolyard oak tree. The principal called a school assembly to make the announcement. He made it sound like the clothes had been laundered and neatly folded, but my dad, a cop at the time, a cop with the bad habit of telling his kids things nobody should have to know, told me Jason's clothes were filthy. Worse than filthy, in fact, matted with urine, feces, and blood. He told me I couldn't repeat it to anybody. I never did. It was too horrifying to even think about, let alone share. That's why I despised Muppet Man. Nobody could say his name without some snot-nosed little jerk from behind the tracks saying Jason's. A horrifying schoolyard litany. That was another problem. The kids at school knew Jason was my neighbor, and they knew my dad was a cop. After weeks of hysterical interest, I was abruptly ostracized. It suited me fine. Over the past couple years, my dad had arrested the parents of at least 2 kids in my class, and they gave me hell for it. It was all right. I preferred books to people anyway and spent every recess reading under the oak tree. Sometimes I pretended to read to Jason's ghost. Penance, I guess, for treating him so poorly. One day in February, I got to school 2 or 3 hours late. I don't remember why. I only remember getting to school and plodding across the empty recess yard. February is a bad month in that particular corner of the world. The sky goes from polished steel in the morning to icy steel in the evening, and at night dims to a flat, watery darkness that makes my heart ache. The plants are all dead, the trees skeletal except for flourishing colonies of mistletoe. It looks like despair. The empty recess yard was no exception. Everything was gray and pale and somehow brittle, like it would crack and shatter if you touched it. The almost preternatural stillness turned that pale winter fragility into something sinister. Paranoia skirled through me suddenly. What if, just what if, it was true? What if the universe was broken? What if the scene before me was a fragile husk, just waiting for a misplaced step to break it into pieces? I swallowed a surge of panic and took extra care with each step, setting my foot down with excruciating gentleness. Sand crunched under my soles. Everything felt solid, but the sense of glassy fragility persisted. I fought the urge to close my eyes and walked as quickly as I dared. My path took me right past the oak tree. Black, blown glass bark glimmered faintly. Branches threw spiderweb patterns against the grim sky. They were bare except for nests of mistletoe. The tree was infested with it. Suddenly, with a disconcerting, painfully adult burst of clarity, it occurred to me. The tree was dying. I slowed to a halt, staring at it with the kind of hushed reverence you're supposed to feel in church. The tree was scary but beautiful at the same time. More than that, it was a pillar of my memory. It was visible from my backyard, towering over the school and my childhood like a reassuring and eternal sentry. Except it wasn't eternal. It would be gone someday, maybe before I left grade school. Maybe sooner. My throat felt hot and tight. I took in the side of the bare branches and tried to mentally edit out the mistletoe clusters. It was difficult. They burst from the tree thicker than summertime leaves, and they kept moving, jostled, no doubt, by the cold winter wind. Except another brutal, bleak epiphany, there was no wind. The dark mistletoe rustled and writhed like a trapped serpent. Cold air stung my eyes as they widened. Bright bursts of color flickered inexplicably among the branches, slithering through the mistletoe like a multicolored feather boa. And glittering in that sinuous rope of color, eyes. Glassy round eyes the color of limes. The rope of color broke into tendrils and grew, not unlike the fungus in which it nested, overtaking the darkness with eye-wateringly vibrant neon hues. Then they twined back together, worming behind branches and mistletoe before resolving into a fluffy, ridiculously proportioned caricature of an animal. A cartoon incarnate. A Muppet. "Hello," it said. Its voice made me jump, full and hearty and unpleasantly friendly. A cartoon voice. My lip trembled. Tears pricked my eyes, scorching and frigid at once. "You're not real." "Yes, I am." It fixed me with a sharp, reptilian stare that made me want to scream. "I might even be realer than you." The world looked glassier than ever, faded and brittle except for the obscenely bright monstrosity above me. I stamped my foot and held my breath, praying that the world would shatter, taking the technicolor monster with it. If I broke a broken world, would I break anything at all? But the pavement remained solid. The frozen chill bypassed the soles of my shoes and leached into my feet. The creature stretched and stretched and stretched, slowly snaking its way down the trunk of the tree. Simultaneously sloth-like and reptilian, bursting with that ridiculous Crayola fur. It should have been funny. Why wasn't it funny? Why was I scared? Why wasn't I running away? It slid down the bark until its eyes were level with my own. Only really real things, it intoned, can hide themselves in plain sight. Real things like me and Jason Hughes. Your friends call me Muppet Man. You can, too. It extended a hand, long and absurdly thin, almost like distorted frog feet except for the rainbow fur. I turned and ran into the school, screaming all the way. The poor nurse tried to extract the story from me. I don't even remember what I said. I just remember hiding under her desk and sobbing. When I finally blubbered the words Muppet Man and Jason, the school went on lockdown. The cops came. My father wasn't with them. I watched through the window, gagging and crying and trying to forget Muppet Man's bright green eyes. But how could I, when everything else, the oak tree and the police, the nurse and the sky and my own shaking hands, looked so brittle and faded? Muppet Man was the only vibrant thing. The only bright thing. The only whole thing. The only real thing. Sometime later, maybe a minute, maybe 10 hours for all I knew, a cop came into the nurse's office. He grabbed my elbow over the protestations of the nurse and marched me outside. The world rushed past me in a gray, dead, glittering blur. The tree loomed ahead, dark and blank and terribly close. I flailed, but he dragged me to the oak tree and shoved me forward. I stopped inches from the bark. Dark and dead and cracked, except for absurd tufts of technicolor fur. "Did you do that?" the cop demanded. "Do what?" I screamed. "Do what?" "Did you put that," he pointed to a particularly obscene knot of neon pink fur, "on this tree?" I told him no. I told him it was Muppet Man, that I'd seen Muppet Man, that Muppet Man knew Jason, and now he knew me. The nurse sent me home shortly thereafter, and my parents packed me off to my grandparents' house in San Diego that very night. I stayed for 3 weeks, stayed until I stopped having nightmares of Muppet Man eating Jason's bloody, soiled clothes while I watched, trapped by his bright eyes like a deer in headlights. I got home on a Wednesday evening. I know it was Wednesday because I remember looking at my mom's calendar. Big and glossy and full of beagle puppies. It always made me smile. My parents fed me Burger King and ice cream cake, then sent me to bed. When I pulled my covers back, I froze. Everything around me blanched, turning pale and glassy. Everything except the dirty tufts of neon bright fur on my pillow. My parents assumed I did it and yelled at me for almost an hour, but they let me sleep in their bed anyway. School was a nightmare. I spent the entire morning dreading recess. When the bell rang, I thought about throwing a tantrum just to stay in the classroom. But I'd get in trouble. My parents would be angry. I'd go to the principal's office. Besides, there'd be other kids on the playground. Vibrant, living, colorful, noisy kids. All that noise and brightness might be too much for Muppet Man. I told myself these things, but still ran to the bathroom when the bell rang. I threw up, then sat in the stall until a teacher, summoned no doubt by a tattletale, came and told me I had to go outside. I dithered in the corner by the tetherball court, as far from the oak tree as I could get. Even from a distance, I thought I caught glimpses of bright fur slithering through the branches. I decided I was seeing things. When the days finally got warmer, steel skies softening to rich blue in the daytime and Easter egg colors at night, bare branches sprouting buds, flowers growing in the planter boxes all around the school, I resumed my recess ritual of reading under the tree. I was cautious at first, but determined. Every adult in my life had me convinced that I was hallucinating. Every kid in the school knew I had a breakdown about Muppet Man. The taunts alone were enough to steal my resolve. Before I knew it, I was reading under the tree like always, the glassy winter horror barely more than memory. One afternoon in April, something pulled me out of my book. I didn't know what it was at first. Maybe the kids screaming on the jungle gym. Maybe the 5th grade girls gossiping a few yards away. Maybe the warm breeze rustling the leaves. I looked down and gasped. Larvae crawled along my arms. The yellow-white caterpillar worms that lived in the bark, the kind all the kids said Muppet Man loved to eat. I ran to the tetherball court and lingered until the bell rang. When I got home that afternoon, I found clusters of neon fur all over my bedroom. I ran to my mother. She lost her temper, marched me into the backyard, and told me to stay until she was done cleaning up after me. When I finished crying, I settled myself under the apricot tree and got lost in my book. As the afternoon light deepened, rich daylight giving way to copper, something snapped me out of my reverie. I looked down and saw white worms. Soft and tiny and somehow wet, inching over my arms. "Hello," whispered an unpleasantly friendly voice. "Sorry it's been so long. I guess I've been a bad friend." "I'm crazy," I whispered. I snapped my book shut and closed my eyes. Crazy, crazy, crazy. Scratchy polyester fur crumpled against my skin. "Not crazy," Muppet Man said. "Just really real, like me and Jason Hughes." "What are you reading?" He reached out, blinding multicolor fur blazing in the dappled sunlight, and flipped the book over. "Black Beauty." "Is it good?" "It's great," I wheezed. I wanted to leap to my feet, wanted to run screaming into the house, but my bones felt watery and frozen at once. I wouldn't be able to stand up, let alone run. Muppet Man brushed the worms off my arm and settled down beside me. His fur made me feel itchy. I didn't look up. I already knew what I would see, that slothy dinosaur face dominated by glassy eyes that would blaze in the dying sun. I didn't want to see it. I was afraid of what would happen if I did. "My mom will see you," I whispered. He patted my arm, fur crunching again. "You should read to me." Tears flooded my eyes. "No." Strong, fuzzy fingers wrapped my wrist. "I want you to read to me." "No. If you read to me, I'll take you to Jason Hughes." I almost scoffed. Jason Hughes with the giant glasses and the keening voice, anxious Jason Hughes who stole all the art paper in the classroom just to draw his stupid fish and stupid beetles, Jason Hughes who'd been reduced to bloody, soiled clothes at the base of the schoolyard tree. "Why?" I asked. "Because we're lonely," Muppet Man said. I glanced at the house, praying my mother would look out and see us. If he's lonely, he should go home. He can't. His mom doesn't like him. I pondered this briefly. I thought of my dad. My poor dad who worked himself to death with overtime. My poor dad who couldn't catch a break at work. But what if I could help him? What if I could find Jason Hughes and give my dad all the credit? When would I see Jason? "It depends," said Muppet Man, "on how well you read." I opened my book to the very first page and began to read aloud. The scrape of the sliding glass door broke my concentration shortly after. I looked up and saw my mom. My heart leapt to my throat. I spun around hopefully, but Muppet Man was gone. The next morning, I found clumps of neon fur in my dresser drawers. It clung to my pants and shirts like lint. At the end of May, I found a note on my windowsill. Neatly folded construction paper printed with brightly colored marker. "Come to the school tree tonight at 11. Your friend, M." Coarse strands of yellow, pink, and blue hair sprinkled the note. I brushed them off and tucked the paper in my pocket. I wasn't stupid. I knew I couldn't go alone. I was terrified of Muppet Man and almost as terrified of what my parents would do to me if they caught me sneaking out. So I went to my father. I showed him the note and begged until I wept. He accused me of making it all up for a while, but in the end, he agreed to take me to the school at the appointed time. We lived only a few blocks away, so we walked. The evening was unseasonably cold, almost as cold as the day I first met Muppet Man. I fought back tears the entire way, clutching my father's hand with both of my own. The school gates were locked, of course, but there was a small gate hidden in a passage behind the cafeteria. It had nothing but a simple latch. The kids all knew about it, but the adults never did anything. I led my father around the perimeter of the playground, keeping close to the buildings in order to hide in the shadows. "Wait here," I whispered. He obliged, looking tired even in the darkness. I looked at the tree. It didn't look sick anymore. Leaves hid the mistletoe infestation. It looked full and healthy, the eternal century once more. I stood by the trunk and whispered, "Hello." Something rustled among the leaves overhead. "Hello," came Muppet Man's warm, full voice. "Where's Jason?" The branches rattled and a dark, furry shape slithered down the tree. Glassy eyes caught the light of the moon and blazed. "He's inside me." Muppet Man twisted and stretched down the tree until his eyes were level with mine. No longer was he vibrant or bright. His fur was filthy, caked with mud and sand, and bare, dirty canvas replaced large swaths of the once lush neon coat. Of course he was missing fur. He'd been leaving clumps of it all over my room for months. It was a wonder he had any hair left. "What do you mean?" My voice issued in a thin, wheezy whine. Muppet Man crept closer, holding me captive with his glass eyes. His long, thin fingers touched his chin and pushed, sliding into his face and pulling it up like a child removing a Halloween mask. My heart thudded, heavy and horrid as a war drum. Enormous glasses glinted in the moonlight, tragically outsized for the decayed little face underneath. Jason Hughes's rotted head was gray and so very fragile, gleaming like clouded glass under the moon. If I touched him, he would shatter. The absurd costume fell to the ground with a whisper. Dull and faded. Even the eyes were dead now. The costume was dead. It had never been alive. Jason's empty sockets bulged, then broke and split apart with a series of soft, papery pops. Something roiled inside, thick and dark and gleaming with 1,000 dim lights and colors I couldn't name. The world flipped and cold playground sand dug into my face. My dad's scream shattered the glassy silence. Perhaps it shattered Jason's poor dead face, too. I curled up and lay still as my dad screamed and sirens wailed in the distance. The ruined costume went into an evidence locker. Jason himself was laid to rest several weeks later. They held onto the body as long as they did in order to find out what happened to him. I asked my father about it, but he refused to tell me. I was disappointed yet relieved, and I never tried to find out on my own. I did my best to forget everything, and actually came close. I might have managed had my father kept his mouth shut. He has a habit of telling me things I shouldn't know. Things nobody should know. I guess it's a personal exorcism, freeing demons that haunt you. It's just that the problem with freeing demons is that demons usually go on to haunt someone else. My dad retired a few years ago, but he still has friends on the force. They get together and talk every once in a while. They had one of their visits last night, and one of his friends brought up Jason Hughes. "Did they find the guy who did it?" my dad asked. "No," said his friend. "But the costume. That weird puppet costume? It's not in evidence anymore. It's gone. Did someone take it? Did they accidentally toss it? We don't know." That alone was enough to haunt me forever. But it didn't stop it enough. Demons never stop it enough, if they ever stop at all. I know this because when I got up this morning, I found dirty tufts of neon fur scattered all across my bedroom floor. Two facts you should probably know. Fact the first: when a human being is driven into a corner, You should never underestimate the levels of stupidity and danger they will resort to in order to escape. Fact the second, if a deal seems too good to be true, it is. Normally, I wouldn't be the kind of guy you should be taking advice from. If I wrote an autobiography, it'd be called Jesus Wept. But in this very specific instance, I have some valuable experience. It started, as most tragic stories tend to, with a series of short-sighted mistakes. About a decade or so back, I was a few years out of college and trying to build a life for myself. I was single, educated, and driven, all the qualities someone needs to succeed in life. Well, not the single part, but you get the idea. I had prospects, some real potential, but, like Oscar Wilde once said, I can resist anything except temptation. Yeah. I was an English major. I didn't get hooked on meth or anything like that. No, my vice was the thrill of chance. Gambling was the greatest rush I'd ever experienced, just giving up control, letting the gods of probability and randomness decide your fate. I got hooked, kept going to those casinos night after night. Looking back, I was naive, I was foolish. It had taken an idiot, blinded by a lust for sensation, to not realize another crucial fact. The house always, I repeat, always wins. To make a long, painful story short, at the tender age of 24, the local pit bosses had taken me for all I was worth and then some. As a result, I was indebted to some unsavory characters who were not all that keen on giving me some leeway on the money I owed them. I managed to pull together just shy of $100 in a week doing odd jobs, but that was a fraction of what I was in for. At the time, it seemed like a better idea to just waste what money I had at a local bar rather than carrying on my sad little exercise in futility. So that's exactly what I did, and by virtue of a few gallons of the cheapest spirits you can possibly imagine, I can't remember a great deal of what happened after that. Next thing I know, I'm waking up in a puddle behind the bar, having been thrown out for making an idiot of myself. The electric buzz of the neon signs above my head felt like I was taking a power drill to the frontal lobe, while the cold, filthy water below my face helped to sober me up a smidgen. Just enough to make me aware. It was right then, in my lowest possible moment, that I met him. "Hey there, buddy," he said, his voice pleasantly cheerful and melodic. "You look like you need a helping hand." Thankfully, I've got two. There was a gentle tug on both of my shoulders, pulling me upright. He leaned me against a wall. I could finally take a better look at him. To begin with, I wondered if I was hallucinating. He seemed so strange, so out of place. My good Samaritan was about 6.5 feet tall, but he was built like a pack of uncooked spaghetti. A long, lean, string bean of a man. That being said, the black and white pinstripe suit he was wearing still somehow managed to be form-fitting, like it was just painted directly onto a featureless body. Above his collar, fastened to the top button and held in place by a large and ugly bow tie, sat a pale, grinning head with black hair parted in the middle. Truth be told, my initial thought after properly taking in the sight of him was as follows: "Holy moly, I died in that puddle, and this is Death himself come to collect my pathetic soul." Sadly, that was not the case. I was, in fact, still alive. "There we are, pal, that's a lot better, isn't it?" he said, kneeling down on his long, real thin legs to look me in the eye. "We'll have you feeling like $1,000,000 in no time." Never fear. While back then I just assumed that it was my drunken mind playing tricks on me, I remember his eyes seeming strangely yellowish. They had a kind of jaundiced sheen to them, like scare and iris just melted together into a single, formless mass. Eyes like egg yolks. "It's always such a shame to catch folks in a pickle, such a shame," he said, largely to himself, I think. "Whatever happened to helping people out, you know? It's a good feeling." "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. The kind stranger smiled and turned his sulphuric eyes towards me. You're asking the wrong person there, amigo. I'd tell you if I knew. Honest, he replied with a laugh. What's your name, though? Nate, I said, wondering if I was about to vomit or not. Nate Wilson. Oh my gosh, that's such an awesome name, the stranger said, as the sudden explosion of interest on his face told me that he wasn't faking his misplaced enthusiasm. Nate Wilson. It has a ring to it, don't you think? Gosh, what a great name. You're a lucky guy, Nate. Lucky to have such a great name. Thanks, I guess. There was a long, awkward silence after that. I sure as heck didn't know what to say, and the stranger seemed more than content to just stand there and stare at me, grinning like a freak. It felt like it was my responsibility to break that irritating silence. Look, I really appreciate you helping me, buddy. I began. Wait, you consider us buddies? He asked. His tone was, at that stage, ambiguous. I mean, you saved me from breathing howling water, so I guess so, yeah. This might seem hard to believe, because I definitely didn't believe it at the time, but the stranger literally jumped up into the air and whooped loudly. A grown man, behind a dive bar, doing that. It was like something out of a strange dream that your one boring friend always wants to tell you about. This is fantastic, he said, grinning ear to ear like he'd just won the lottery. It's so wonderful to make new friends. He extended a spindly arm towards me, his hand open and his spidery fingers outstretched. Put her there, friendo, he said. And because that night wasn't weird enough already, you better believe I did. That's what I'm talking about, he said with another childish cackle, pulling me to my feet with disarming levels of strength. Through the power of friendship, anything is possible. Sure, he may have spoken like his only experience with the outside world was watching Saturday morning cartoons, but he seemed innocent enough. A benign weirdo, just trying to help people along his way. Though I must admit, the fact he was reluctant to tell me his name was somewhat of a red flag for me. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you, Nate, he began, his amber gaze turned downwards in what might have been embarrassment. There was a reason I followed you out here. It wasn't just a stroke of good luck. My heart immediately sank. I knew he was too good to be true. This was when he stabbed me, cut me up, wore my skin as a suit and turned the rest of me into a makeshift lasagna. Nobody was ever that happy at that hour of the night if they had all their psychological ducks in a row. Well, if you're being honest, I said, swaying on my feet, still too drunk to defend myself, would that reason happen to be my murder? He seemed shocked at first, then began to laugh. Do you think a murderer would be this friendly? He asked. Assault, then? Jesus, no way, Nate. You're a good-looking guy, don't get me wrong, but you're not really my type. Then what does a guy like you have to do with a guy like me? I asked, the needle on my internal emotive scale creeping from curious to irritated. Well, he paused again, as though searching for the proper words. He was looking at everything but me. The bar, he finally said. How much of what happened in there do you remember? Somewhere in the margin of nothing, I think, I said, now leaning against the wall for support. You were talking to the bartender. Loudly, he said, bouncing up and down on the balls of his feet. I wasn't eavesdropping, not at all, I just happened to overhear. You were talking about some kind of money troubles. I'd almost forgotten about them myself, but the second he said it, all the memories came barreling into me like some nauseating tidal wave. I'd ranted and raved, screamed at the top of my lungs. Debt. I got belligerent when I felt they weren't showing me enough sympathy, and when I got belligerent, I was readily thrown out on my inebriated behind. Oh, don't worry about those, I said, my cheeks reddening with shame. That's not your problem. I'll deal with it. But Nate, you didn't sound like you could deal with it. What the heck is it to you? I snapped back. The stranger stopped talking and began reaching into his jacket. I got a sudden flash of paranoia that he worked for one of the casinos, and he was going to put a bullet between my eyes. "You're my best friend, Nate," he said. "And friends are meant to help each other out of sticky situations, aren't they?" He produced a stack of bills from a pocket inside his suit and passed it over to me. "Will this be enough?" he asked. At this point, I was most open to the idea of this all being some crazy dream. With the ferocity of a madman, I quickly counted the money this total stranger, calling me his best friend, had handed to me. $20,000. It could bail me out, and then some. "Holy cow," I said, though I can't remember if it was out loud or in my head. "I can't possibly accept this." "Please do," he said with another ear-to-ear grin. "You need it an awful lot more than I do." A sober me might have been too proud to indulge him, but, funnily enough, drunk me had a far more realistic take on my level of desperation. I was a desperate man, trapped in a corner. Fact the first, when a human being is driven into a corner, you should never underestimate the levels of foolish and dangerous actions they will resort to in order to escape. But why, was the only question I could summon. He smiled and shrugged. "Because I like you," he said. "And I like helping people. But you've only just met me. So what? A friend is a friend is a friend. Why overthink it?" I collapsed back against the wall, holding the stranger's 20 grand. It was a way out of my dire situation. "I'll pay you back. Every penny, with interest, I swear to goodness," I said. The stranger laughed. "No need, I've got no shortage of money. Just take it and bail yourself out, okay? Then promise me you'll stop gambling." There were big, swollen tears running down my burning cheeks. The stranger's kindness was baffling, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever experienced. He was a true saint in flesh and blood. "I'll never gamble another penny," I said. Without another word, I lunged forward and hugged him. A long, warm, tight embrace. By the end, I could feel his emaciated limbs wrapped across my back. "Thank you so much," I whispered, my tears dripping onto the shoulder of his suit. "We're friends for, right?" When I finally pried myself off him, I just couldn't stop laughing. It was nerves, probably. The stranger watched me, a kind of eccentric joy burning in his big, yellow eyes. He seemed to like just observing. "Oh, one more thing," he said, reaching into his jacket again. "A little something I wrote up in the bar, just to help you out." He passed me a piece of paper, folded into the size of a pamphlet. I didn't even think to check it at the time. I just shoved it into the pocket of my filthy coat and carried on thanking him. I needed that money, Lord knows I did, but I couldn't just take it without giving something in return. "There must be something you want, man," I pleaded, palms open in deference to his generosity. "Anything. I owe you my life, man, you just name your price." "I can't thank you enough." The stranger grinned and stroked his narrow chin in contemplation. "Now that's an irresistible offer," he said, almost jokingly. "You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Wilson. Leave it with me, okay? I'm sure I'll think of something." He began walking away after that, whistling, of all things, sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows as he did so. Now I was laughing again. Half out of giddiness, half an acknowledgement of the sheer strangeness of the events transpiring around me. Right then, as I sat outside a dingy bar, covered in dirty water, my own tears, and more than a little puke, I was the luckiest human being on the planet. "What do you give to the man who has everything?" I said aloud. The stranger looked over his shoulder at me one more time, his odd eyes meeting mine. "Almost everything, Nate," he corrected. "Almost everything." And just like that, the stranger was gone. Almost funny, isn't it? How someone like that can have such a profound impact on your life, then just up and disappear just as quickly. Like a comet, just trailing past. You only catch its light for a brief instant, then it's dark again. Using the stranger's money, I paid off my gambling debts in full and still had a little left over. I swore to stick to my promise, for my own sake and his. In the 10 years that be passed since that day, I haven't gambled a cent. Once I was all square with the house, I finally took a moment to check the piece of paper that he'd left me with. At first, I only sort of skimmed it, and it didn't make a great deal of sense to me, just a list of dates from 2007 to 2017, each accompanied by a sentence fragment. It was only when I sat down and took a long, hard look at what those fragments actually were that I realized the stranger couldn't possibly have been human. No, he was so much more than that. It was a list of instructions, specific down to the days, minutes, hours, and seconds. Where to be and what to do in order to maximize success at that given moment. He'd left stock tips for companies that didn't exist but would come into existence exactly when he predicted they would. He'd left exact instructions on which house to buy and how to get it at the best price. Clothes to wear, jobs to take, friends to make. 5th of October, 2009. Go to Starbucks in town. Meet Jesse O'Brien. 3:51 and 17 seconds p.m. 2 years later, Jesse O'Brien became Jesse Wilson. The stranger had even engineered me meeting the love of my life, precise to the exact second we'd first make eye contact. I invested in the right stocks and pulled out of the wrong ones, avoiding company deaths and market crashes like some financial Houdini. My capital skyrocketed, and my personal wealth just grew greater and greater. 8th of June, 2011. Buy house 10, Aspen Way. Don't rent. 6:14 and 43 seconds p.m. And so I did. Jesse and I moved into that big, gorgeous house once our honeymoon was over. We were wealthy, healthy, and deeply in love, but something was missing, something the stranger had accounted for, too. 17th of August, 2012. Conceived child with Jesse. 8:31 and 19 seconds p.m. Our little girl is called April. The stranger picked it, not me. She's 4 now, and I love her with all my heart. The stranger, a man who I'd known for less than an hour, had steered the entire course of my life in the best possible direction, out of nothing more than the kindness of his heart. He'd saved me, he'd saved all of us. Even though it had been 10 years since that day and I was drunk out of my mind at the time, I remember every detail vividly. That's why, as I was walking down the street this morning, my arms full of grocery bags, when I heard someone singing Sunshine, Lollipops, and Rainbows a few feet behind me, I recognized the voice instantly. Sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, everything that's wonderful is what I feel when we're together. His melodic voice sang, his tone screaming joviality. Brighter than a lucky penny, when you're near the rain just disappears, dear, and I feel so fine. Without a moment's hesitation, I turned to face him. It looked like that strange man hadn't aged a day in an entire decade. He even wore that same pinstriped suit that he had on the first night I met him. Just to know that you are mine. He finished the verse with a smile and threw open his arms. Jesus Christ, I said, my face cracking into a smile impossible to hide, it's actually you. The one and only, baby, he said with a laugh and a grandiose hand gesture. How's Jesse, by the way? I opened my mouth to answer, but he raised a hand, as though to politely silence me. I'm sorry to drop it after, gosh, has it really been 10 years? Geez Louise, time really does tend to get away from me, he said. Anyway, the reason I'm here is because I finally figured out what I wanted from you. Beg your pardon? 10 years ago, you said you owed me something, anything, he replied, though I almost heard it back in my own voice as he said it. I couldn't decide at the time, but I think I know now. Oh, of course. That's wonderful to hear, man, I said, my heart filled with sudden trepidation. So, what is it you want? The stranger gave that same ear-to-ear grin that he was wearing back behind the dive bar in 2007. Well, I've thought about it for a long time, amigo, and I've finally made my decision, he said. I know what I want from you, Nate. He paused to take a step closer to me. His eyes were just as golden in the daylight. I want your name, Nate. I almost laughed to begin with, but I soon realized he wasn't joking. He was deadly serious. My name? Yes, Nate, I've always loved your name. It's so wonderful, he said, wringing his hands with glee. See, I've never had a name myself, and it's always left me feeling a little left out, you know? I've wanted a name for so long, and I decided just recently that the name I want is yours. I think it'll fit me just right. This man had given me my entire life. He saved me from getting killed by casino sharks back in '07, and every wonderful success I'd had since I owed entirely to his decade-long itinerary. With all this in mind, who was I to turn him down this last crazy request? If he wanted to go around calling himself Nate Wilson too, what right did I have to stop him? Sure thing, buddy, I said with a smile. He leaned forward and embraced me, almost crushing the groceries against my chest. You have no idea how happy you've made me. It's the least I can do after all you've done for me, I replied. The stranger, or rather, Nate Wilson, extended another spidery hand towards me. Let's shake on it, he said, his voice elated. And I did. We went our separate ways after that. I walked home, and he ran off into the city, singing and cackling with mirth. It brought me some peace of mind to know that my debt to him was finally repaid, and that some simple token gesture was all that I needed to do it. When I arrived back at 10 Aspen Way, I saw April playing around with her toy lawnmower in the front yard. I smiled and called to her, but she didn't respond. She was too wrapped up in her fictitious duties. I made my way inside with the groceries. Jessie was in the kitchen, cutting up carrots. Sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows blasted out of the radio. Today just kept getting weirder and weirder. Hey, babe, I called to her, putting the groceries on the kitchen table. You'll never guess who I ran into this morning. Jessie didn't respond. She just carried on chopping and hummed to the tune. Babe? Everything okay? I asked. Still no response. At this point, I was beginning to get a little worried. With a peculiar heaviness to my every movement, I walked over to Jessie and placed a tentative hand on her shoulder. It just went straight through. Straight through her body, like she was a hologram, or I was. I recoiled with a short, sharp yelp and fell against the kitchen table. Again, no response from Jessie. What the heck had happened? Honey, I'm home. I heard a familiar voice call from the hallway outside. Jessie suddenly perked up, turning her head towards the noise. Hi, sweetie, she said. You were a while out there. I was beginning to get worried. The stranger walked into the kitchen, a smile stretched across his waxen face. Sorry about that, honey bunny, he said. I met an old friend in town. We had a little catch-up. As he said that last part, he threw me a sickening wink with one of his golden peepers. Jessie said, anyone I know? She leaned forward and gave the stranger a kiss. The kind of kiss she always gave me. Nah, the stranger said with a chuckle, I don't think you've ever met him. I felt like my mind was going to implode. Nothing going on was making any kind of sense. The whole world had gone crazy. April called from outside, something about the grass. You mind taking over the carrots for a sec, babe? Jessie said to the stranger, I better go check on April. No problem, honey, he said, taking the knife from her hand and giving her another kiss. Jessie left the room, leaving just me and the stranger, all alone. I quietly fumed and ate chopped carrots. What the heck is going on? I finally asked him, when I gained the modicum of composure required to do so. What have you done, you crazy weirdo? He carried on chopping the carrots. His eyes never left the chopping board. My name is Nate, stranger, he said. I'd really appreciate it if you called me by it. In my state of fury, I tried to grab him by the shoulder and turn him to face me. I could actually touch him, but he wouldn't budge. It was like trying to move a mountain. That's my name. This is my house. And that's my wife, I said to him, rage and confusion rendering my voice a crackling mess. I want you out of here and out of my life. The stranger chuckled. See, that's where you're wrong, slick. All that changed hands, he said. This is Nate Wilson's house. Jessie is Nate Wilson's wife, and this is Nate Wilson's life. And, by the terms of our recent deal, I'm Nate Wilson. And you, good buddy? You're nobody. I won't accept that. I yelled, slamming my hand down onto the kitchen countertop. Without another word, Nate Wilson rammed the knife through my hand. There was no pain, no blood. It just phased through, as though I no longer even existed. Word to the wise, stranger, reality marches on regardless of whether you accept it, he said, as I pulled my hand away from the knife. Everything you have, everything you've tricked yourself into believing you earned, you got from my instructions. You never owned this life, stranger, you just rented it from me, piece by piece. Now, it's mine, and there's not a thing you can do about it. He stuck the knife into the chopping board and turned around to me. Except, of course, leave and let me, my wife, and my daughter get on with our lives. Do you understand, stranger? I stood in crushing silence for a minute or two. But can I see them again? Sure, you can. You can see them any time you like, but only I can see you. Just like, up until around an hour ago, only you could see me. It doesn't feel good, does it? Being nobody. Being nameless. The gravity of it all was finally closing in. I fell onto my ass and began to cry. God, I was so stupid, I said. How did I fall for all this? Nate Wilson shrugged and ate a piece of carrot. Don't blame yourself, buddy, he said. I was waiting for centuries before I found someone who I could interact with. It isn't your fault you happened to be that person, or that you had such an awesome name at the time. My name. You were only going to waste it, friendo. If I wasn't there that night, a heavy would have broken your legs the next day, you'd have gotten into painkillers, and OD'd a few months later. Nate Wilson becomes gravestone fodder. What a waste that would have been, huh? But what do I do now? What I did, stranger, Nate Wilson said, eating another piece of carrot with undue relish. Ask around, find someone you can talk to. Might be this afternoon, who knows? Sure, could be a week, month, year, decade, century, but I'm an eternal optimist. A century? I said, trying to ebb the stream of tears flowing out of me. I can't wait that long. You'd be surprised, pal. Patience is something you'll learn, being nameless. When you finally do manage to wrangle yourself a name, you'll appreciate it a little more this time. You'll make something of yourself. Fact the second, if a deal seems too good to be true, it is. So is that it? I asked, is that all you have for me? Nate Wilson nodded. I'm afraid so, good buddy, he said, but you seem like a nice enough guy. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You can always depend on the kindness of strangers, don't you know? As the man who had just stolen my entire existence carried on hacking up vegetables, I left the room, walking out of the kitchen, through the hallway, then out of the house entirely. I stole one last look at Jesse and April, his family, playing on the lawn, totally carefree. All smiles. They'd never even know that I was gone. Perhaps it was better that way, no heartache. I whispered a goodbye that they'd never hear and closed my eyes in a pointless attempt to shut off the tears I knew would be coming either way. I set off into the city after that, walking alone, in search of something, anything, to calm myself. And that was that. The story of my unnaming. Perhaps Nate was right, perhaps it was his life all along. Maybe he'll live it better, live it kinder. He might be a better father, a better husband, a better Nate. I don't feel so attached to that name anymore. But if you know all this now, that means one good thing: you can read what I'm writing. If you can read my words, perhaps you can hear them? And if you can hear them, perhaps you can reply. If so, I hope to hear from you soon. We have a lot to talk about, you and I, a lot to discuss. I think I can do some great things for you, dear reader, dear friend. I'll help you out of any bind you need, and I'll barely ask for anything in return. Barely anything at all. My brother discovered a new way to walk, and something went horribly wrong. So you know the acrobat and the flea, right? I nodded as my brother stood in the living room, delivering his presentation. He was 16 and one of the smartest people I've ever met. That being said, he was also reckless, and sometimes his curiosity and crazy theories got the best of him. Imagine a tightrope, he said, stretching a piece of thread between his hands as a visual aid. The acrobat, he continued, can only move in two directions. Back and forth. I nodded again, starting to wonder what he was getting at. The flea, however, has two additional directions: forward, back, left, and right. This is seen as a metaphor, an aid for our understanding, per se, for just how much we cannot get to yet. We are the acrobat in this plane of reality. I nodded along again. But that's exactly what my question is. What if we had the ability to move like the flea? I shook my head. Damien, there's no way. But there is, he continued enthusiastically, dramatically beginning to write on the whiteboard he had brought in with him. It requires a great deal of chemical knowledge, however, and has taken me about a year to research to get it to work. But I think it's finally ready, he rambled, not looking up from his writing. He finally capped the marker he was writing with and turned to face me. He had drawn a diagram on the whiteboard, illustrating his project. I didn't understand any of it. Basically, atoms like to fuse with other atoms to make compounds. But what if we utilize this to get places? He continued. He was delusional, I was sure of it. For example, oxygen likes to fuse with oxygen to make O2. It's just the way it works. They need to share electrons to be stable, and they usually bind to the closest oxygen in proximity. Yeah, I know how it works. I took chem in high school, I said, but what are you getting at? He paused and said his next words in nearly a whisper. I've figured out how to teleport, Maria, he said as he leaned in. His words were laced with almost a sense of childlike wonder, like a kindergartner who had found a cool rock and was showing it to his friends. How? I queried, my eyes widening with wonder. Had he really? What if, instead of atoms bonding with the ones close to them that stabilize them, they bonded as we choose them to, with which ones we choose them to? He began to point to the pictures in the diagram he had drawn. Now, of course, they have to stabilize each other electron-wise. There's no controlling that. But I figured out a way to choose, for example, which oxygen bonds to which oxygen. I nodded. For this experiment, I used specifically water molecules, H2O, because the bonds they form aren't too hard to build and break, and they're quite abundant. I raised my hand timidly. My brother was 3 years younger than me, and it was kind of amusing that I was so confused by what he was saying. So sorry, I know I'm kind of rambling, and you look confused. To put it in the simplest way possible, I can take a hydrogen atom from my body and force it to bond with another hydrogen and an oxygen anywhere in the world, causing me, by some occurrence I can't exactly explain, to be taken with it, forming an H2O at the secondary location. But it works, and that's all I need to know. Have you tried it yet? I just told you it works. Of course I've tried it, he scoffed. Show me, I ushered. He sighed. If I must, skeptic, he said jokingly. I don't know how he did it, but almost instantaneously, he appeared on the other side of the room. Ta-da! I was beyond shocked. I was bewildered. There's no way, I stuttered. There is, my dear sister. And I discovered it. So how do you get it to work? He paused. I don't know. I kinda just do it, he shrugged. I picture the atoms bonding, and it happens. Thoughts were racing through my head at 100 miles a minute. Do you realize how powerful this is? I asked, hesitantly. He thought for a minute. No, I don't. Holy crap. He looked me in the eyes, then shouted excitedly. Holy crap. He smiled and jumped up and down with joy. He touched his head and made crazy hand gestures as he went on. I figured out how to control matter. I smiled. I was happy for him, but this whole thing was surreal. It wasn't right. All I wanted to do was teleport, and he paused, speechless from his own excitement. This is awesome. He squealed again. He blipped out of the room in the blink of an eye, and then I heard him yell from the other side of the house. I'm over here. Then the whiteboard disappeared. I followed his voice and found him outside, once again in awe. I watched him examine the whiteboard. As I looked closer at what he was analyzing, I noticed a chunk of stuff fused to the back of the whiteboard. What's going on? I asked. It looks like, because the chemical compounds are more difficult to build and break, it did it the easiest way, and this mass formed. Why? He thought harder before answering my question. It didn't just make a simple water. The molecules in it are more complex. I shrugged. It's curious. I'll have to research it more, he muttered before breaking into a smile again. The next day, I woke up to my alarm and walked out into the kitchen to get some water. Boo! Damien shouted from behind me. He wasn't there before. I see you're enjoying your discovery, I commented, playfully nudging him. Before I knew it, my nudge had caused him to lose his balance. He cried out in pain as he lay on the floor. Oh my God, are you okay? I'm so sorry. I frantically apologized and bent over to help him up. Only he didn't get up. He winced and then looked at me, tears in his eyes. It hurts. Then I noticed his foot was stuck in the floor. That's what had caused him to lose his balance, and now the bone stuck out at a grotesque angle. Maria, call 911 or something, it hurts. Oh my God, he moaned in pain. I hastily picked up my phone and dialed 911, and I sat next to my brother, clutching his hand until the emergency crew arrived. What the paramedic stopped short as he went to examine Damien's leg, upon noticing his foot had clipped into the floor like a video game glitch. I'm stuck, he cried. The paramedic radioed in the fire department to try to get Damien out. Can't you just unbond them or something? He gritted his teeth and shook his head. No. I can only make bonds. He let out another scream of pain, beginning to hyperventilate. The paramedic turned back around to face us and clipped his radio back onto his belt. Damien didn't pass out until the EMT cut off his pant leg and he saw his bone. I even got nauseous looking at it, and I could feel his pain. How did this happen? The fire department arrived with saws and other tools and chopped up the floor in order to get my brother out. His foot was still intact, but his leg was now broken because some molecule didn't form the right way, as he explained to me after he woke up in the hospital. He'll have to be non-weight bearing for about 2 months, as that was a pretty nasty break, the doctor explained. Say, how did you get stuck in a perfectly intact floor like that anyway? He queried. My brother shrugged. He was discharged 3 days later after a few nights in the hospital due to the break needing surgery to repair. When our parents heard about it, they considered cutting their trip short, but my brother argued with them over the phone and insisted that he would be fine, so they didn't. Over the next few days, Damien was getting better. He wasn't as tired and grumpy, and he was in slightly less pain than before. I decided to bring breakfast into his room, and as I opened the door, the tray disappeared straight out of my hands and appeared in his lap. Damien. He grinned. You don't have to wait on me. I can do that all myself now. But what about your accident? What if something else happens? That teleporting thing doesn't seem very stable. You worry too much. I'll be fine, he said through a mouthful of eggs I made. I left him to his own devices and decided to watch TV. I was hours into a rewatch of The Office when I heard Damien call my name. I followed his voice to the bathroom and found him standing on his crutches and looking in the mirror. Maria. He mumbled. Yes? Something's wrong, he said meekly, turning to face me. I looked at him in shock as I saw what had happened. Giant masses of stuff protruded from his head and body like it had on the whiteboard. I could make out a PlayStation controller lodged between his eyes and a chunk of the console and wires dangling out of his chest. There were no wounds either. It was terrifying. I just wanted to play some video games, so I summoned my controller. And his eyes started to fill with tears. I don't know how to undo all of this. Oh my God, do you want me to take you to the hospital? I asked, my entire body shaking with anxiety. I was looking at my brother, who was now a mangled mess of random matter, and I didn't know what to do. No. They won't know how to fix it. I'm gonna try myself. He shut his eyes and concentrated hard, but nothing happened. In fact, it got worse. The masses grew bigger, and my brother began to fade away. He won't come out of the bathroom. Every time I go to check on him, it's worse. I try talking to him, but he's just not there anymore. It's almost like the extra matter made him a zombie. I don't know what to do. My parents won't know what to do, and neither will the hospital. Even the kid who made the discovery, my genius brother, doesn't know how to reverse it. And the masses of matter just keep getting bigger. The bathroom door has started to bow outwards, and soon it will break, and the masses will grow into the hallway and the rest of the house. I don't know how far it will go. All I know is that my brother is still in there, trying desperately to make it go away, but alas, it only gets bigger. I don't know how big it's going to get, and my brother won't listen to my pleading for him to stop. Basement cameras. I worked part-time security on the night shift at a psychiatric hospital one summer while studying at college. I worked with an older guy named Vincent. He had worked security there for years, so he sorts of broke me in until I was ready to spend the shift on my own. The hospital itself dates back to 1845, although much of the building was built far more recently when they extended it in the 90s. It's huge. From outside, it gives the impression of a sprawling Victorian mansion house. That first week, he showed me around, which took almost half an hour considering its size. We began in the security office where Vincent pointed to the tags posted under each monitor identifying what area you were looking at on camera. Then we walked quickly through the patrol route I was to take on each shift, pointing out the various areas of the hospital as we went. We took the elevator to the basement floor where we passed a large set of double doors. "That's the abandoned section of the hospital," Vincent told me. I thought he shivered a little when he said it. Operating rooms used to be through there before the new section was built. Elevator breaks down quite a lot on this side, old wiring, he told me. "If you want to get back up, you gotta go through there," he said, pointing at the double doors. He looked me in the eyes and accentuated as he spoke, the way people do when giving you instructions you must remember. "You'll find the stairs to the first floor at the end. Just keep walking though until you reach it." I stepped forward to peer through the glass panes on the door, but Vincent placed a hand in front of me and continued to hold my gaze with an expression of grave seriousness on his face. "Now, it's pitch black down there and sometimes you have to fumble around in the dark to find the light switch. There's a slight delay, so doesn't worry if they don't come on right away." His seriousness turned to a look of sympathy then, and he placed a hand on my shoulder. "You'll be okay," he said. He was trying to be reassuring, but I didn't understand why. I didn't understand why he was making a big deal of it. Before we left, I took another look at the basement corridor. Something didn't seem right. Then I realized what it was. I was sure I had seen a metal gurney here when I looked at the image on the monitors above, the one tagged basement. It was gone now. The second week I was on my own. It was a little lonely at times, but I enjoyed the solitude too. I would bring a laptop along and read while listening to music. On this particular night, something caught my eye, a flash of movement on the monitors. It was too quick for me, but I could see one of the doors on the basement level was wide open. One of my duties is to make sure the rooms are clear and locked, so I got up to check it out. I took the elevator down and quickly found the open door. It was just an empty room. I'm not sure what its purpose had been. Clearly, there was nobody inside, so I locked the door, did a quick sweep of some of the other rooms, and then headed back down the corridor to leave. I had the uncomfortable feeling that I was being watched, but I put it down to silence that surrounded me, making me uneasy. I pushed the call button, but no elevator came. I pressed my ear to the metal doors, listening for the sound of movement, but all I heard were faint creaks and the occasional indeterminate sounds of pipes and other noises that old buildings make. I turned to the heavy doors of the abandoned section. I'd have to make my way through to the stairs that Vincent mentioned. I understood why Vincent might have been uneasy about the place. It was eerie. Apart from the almost total lack of light, it was also incredibly warm and stuffy down there due to the heating being on constantly. I don't know why they bother to keep it heated. The corridor was littered with junk, metal bed frames, cardboard boxes. You're completely alone down there, surrounded by pitch black empty rooms and hallways. Even during the day, it's likely the nearest living soul is halfway across the building. I began to navigate through the corridors, remembering to turn off the lights as I went, leading each preceding corridor in darkness. I wished Vincent had at least walked me through, so I know how far I had to go. I flicked the switch of the next corridor and waited for the lights to slowly blink on one by one, but nothing happened. I flicked the switch again uselessly. The lights from the corridor behind me provided just enough light that I could make my way through and find the switch for the corridor beyond, which I managed to do successfully, only losing my nerve once when my arm brushed against some spider web. I had to make a second trip to turn off the lights of the previous corridor before I proceeded again to the next room. I could see the exit sign ahead now. From behind, I heard a faint squeaking sound. I turned and peered into the blackness beyond the doors, I could tell the sound had come from a good distance behind me, somewhere back there in the dark. The sound came again, louder this time, nearer. Whoever was back there was getting closer. It sounded like somebody running their fingers over glass while running past it. Squeak. Is somebody there? I called. No answer came. There was a loud crash of metal that startled me so much I recoiled a little. I was genuinely creeped out now, so I booted out of there pretty fast. I reached the stairs to the second floor. I'd forgotten to turn off the lights, but I didn't care. I climbed the stairs, my heart thumping out of my chest. I pushed the crash bar on the fire doors and escaped into the reassuring brightness of the hospital. I began to relax again as I walked back to the security office. I felt pretty silly actually for getting in such a panic. Still, I wouldn't like to venture down there again tonight, I thought. The rest of the shift went by without any strangeness. The monitor showed only the hospital's empty corridors when I returned. I had put the experience behind me until the next morning when I saw Vincent. He was sitting in front of the monitors, but he stood up when I walked in. "How did the shift go?" he asked. "All right, I guess. I went to check out the basement and the elevator died on me, but I found the stairs like you said. Otherwise, nothing to report." I told him about the elevator working. I didn't mention what happened after that. Then he got that sympathetic look in his eyes again. "Who was that in the basement?" "Who was what?" I asked. He paused for a moment. "You didn't see anybody?" "See what?" "I had to ask before I showed you," he said. "What do you mean?" "Show me what?" Then he showed me surveillance footage of the basement. There are 2 cameras on the basement level, since that area connects to the morgue where bodies are brought out and where deliveries are brought in. I stared at the monitor and saw myself leave the elevator and walk down the hall. There was nothing apparently unusual until I noticed something on the second hallway camera. Standing just below the camera, almost out of frame, was what appeared to be the figure of a bald man. Only his upper half was visible, and he was facing away from the camera with his face in his palms like he was in pain. I felt my blood go cold as I watched myself turn the corner and walk down the hall. It would have been impossible not to see him standing there, but I walked straight towards him, completely oblivious to his presence. I locked the door, did my sweep, and headed back to the elevator, all while the man remained standing with his head in his hands. I left the frame as I headed to the abandoned section. The man made some movement. He jerked his head from his hands as though something had caught his attention, and now he was listening. Moments passed, and the man made no further movements. There are no cameras in the old section of the hospital, so I could only estimate I should be almost to the stairs at this point. Then it happened, the scene that has caused me endless sleepless nights. I witnessed the nightmare that the security cameras had recorded. The man's arms reached behind him to grab something, then he began to move at a sickening speed, and I saw that he had not been standing at all. This man had no legs to speak of. He was dragging behind him a metal stretcher, on which was piled various human appendages, hands, arms, legs, all of which appeared to be moving. The eviscerated man's upper body was somehow propelling itself down the corridor at such speed that the stretcher swerved and struck the walls. Suddenly, the image flickered, and suddenly there were hospital apparatus strewn in the corridor that had not been there before, and blood and grime seemed to coat the floors. The second camera revealed more stretchers containing animated human parts. A leg lay on the floor, flopping about and kicking the air. A man missing his arms and legs struggled in a wheelchair he was tied to. A group of monstrosities had just begun to shamble into frame when Vincent stopped the tape and turned to me. "You see some strange things on the cameras sometimes." I let out the breath I'd been holding and waited for the feeling in my legs to return when he said, "Just be thankful you don't see those things with your eyes." Hostel life. I attend my country's university, which provides a hostel for students from other districts. I'm from Brunei, which I doubt many of you know about, my almost non-existent country, and this is just something I encountered during one of my nights at the hostel. I speak my country's native language, which is Malay, so I'm trying my best to translate it to English. Please bear with me. It was just like any other night. Most of the hostel residents had gone back to their respective homes due to semester break. The hostel was eerily quiet except for a few students like me who couldn't be bothered to make the trip home. My roommate and I were just chilling in our room, but she was unusually quiet. Sarah is usually cheerful and talkative, always discussing boy bands and other girly things which annoy me, but I'm glad to have a roommate at a time like this. I tried to strike up a conversation with her several times, but she just shook her head and lay in bed. I gave up, plugged in my iPod, and tried to go to sleep. As my eyelids were getting heavier, something cold brushed against my leg. I abruptly opened my eyes to see Sarah staring back at me. "What on earth, Sarah?" I was almost shouting by that point. She had been unresponsive the whole night, and now she was staring directly at me. "I need to go to the bathroom," she said flatly. I glanced at my watch. It was 1:17 a.m. I yawned and lazily got out of bed, only to see her already halfway out the door. Our room was on the 4th floor, and each floor had its own bathroom. But for some reason, Sarah went down to the ground floor and entered that bathroom. I was annoyed at this point, but I figured she probably just needed company because she's a bit of a scaredy cat. I waited for her outside the bathroom, leaning against a wall and looking at the forest next to our hostel. She took a long time, but I assumed she was just taking her time. As I was about to go in to check on her, a couple of other hostel residents walked past, presumably coming from the canteen. Among them was Kim, who was in the same biology course as Sarah and me. "Hey, what are you doing out here all alone?" "It's almost 2 a.m., Kim asked, looking at me with concern. She was always considered the motherly figure of our group. "Oh, just waiting for Sarah outside the bathroom. She's been in there a while. I guess she's having a long bathroom break," I chuckled. Kim's face turned pale, and she glanced at her friends, who mirrored her expression. Sarah went home after dinner. Her parents picked her up, Kim stammered with each word. I tilted my head, thinking she might be joking, only to see tears welling up in her eyes. "Are you serious?" "I've been in the room with her all night." Kim was almost crying now, and I knew she wasn't joking. My blood ran cold. My heart pounded in my chest. Who was in the room with me, and more importantly, who was in the bathroom right now? I didn't dare to check. Kim urged me to sleep in her room for the night, and I immediately agreed. "Sarah, I'm heading to bed. I'm not feeling well and I'm really tired," I called out towards the bathroom. I was trembling at this point, and Kim's face was streaked with tears. Just as we were about to leave, someone from inside the bathroom responded, "Tired? Or did you just find out?" My partner's news. I remember it all very clearly. It was actually the same night of the call that she told me. We were an hour into our overnight shift when she lowered the radio and said, "So, Jack, you're gonna have to find yourself a new partner in a few months." I turned my head to look at her, eyes narrowed. "What, are you quitting?" "Why?" She laughed a little. "No, not quitting. That's not the plan, anyway. I'll probably come back, but well, I'm actually pregnant." "Oh. Well, congratulations," I replied. Good for her, I thought. She and her husband had been trying for the better part of a year. She tried not to show it, but after working with her for 6 years, I could tell she'd been getting worried. I'll bet you and Sam are ecstatic. When's the due date? Thanks. She seemed almost relieved, like she'd been worried I'd be disappointed or something. We're expecting in April, so like 7 months? They said the 16th, but I don't know anyone who's ever actually delivered on their due date. Wait, I interjected, suddenly mock serious. You don't think, if you're gone, are they going to stick me with Henderson? I grabbed her shoulder, my eyes panicked. Carter, you can't leave me with Henderson. Please. Don't leave. She rolled her eyes, chuckling. Don't take maternity, Carter, I'm serious, I continued. We can take the baby with us. He'll help us solve crimes, we'll be a famous trio. Please, don't make me partner with Henderson, the guy's a moron. I'll be forced to run him over with the squad car, and that's if he doesn't hit me first. Suddenly an announcement came through the radio. At that point, Carter was laughing so hard we had to ask them to repeat it. What a wild message it was, a homicide and child abduction in a secluded house in the woods. Carter and I got serious real fast. You gotta understand, the really violent, crazy cases aren't exactly unheard of out here in the country. We've got our share of nuts, but these things don't happen every day either. Anyway, it turned out Carter and I were the closest cops to the scene of the crime, so we were assigned to investigate. We pulled up to the house after 10 minutes of driving. We knocked on the door and were greeted by a serious-looking man, about 50. He introduced himself as Mike and explained that he was a neighbor from about a half-mile down the road. He'd been trying to comfort the woman who owned the home, who had called him up immediately after the homicide took place. He led us to her. She was sitting at her kitchen table, crying hysterically. It took a good 5 minutes of Carter hugging and consoling the woman before she was calm enough to talk to us. We introduced ourselves and got her name, Amy. Then she started her story. She was my husband's sister, Amy sniffed. To be clear, Carter responded, you're talking about the person who killed your husband? Amy's face crunched up, like she was about to start sobbing again, but she just blew her nose and nodded. After taking a second to compose herself, she continued. Her name was, is Angela. We hadn't seen her in a number of years. She had moved out west to Nevada for a long time and led kind of a bohemian lifestyle, living with friends of hers, out in the desert, doing God knows what. She was always strange like that, but certainly never criminal. Anyway, for the whole time she was out there, she and Joe's my husband, they barely talked. She was pretty much unreachable. She never had any interest in coming back to visit, and I always kind of assumed she couldn't afford the travel expenses anyway. But when she found out we had Kyle, her voice choked up and she began to cry again. We waited patiently. We already knew from the dispatch that Kyle was her infant son who had been abducted by the murderer. Excuse me, I'm sorry, she said, blowing her nose again. Anyway, when she found out we had Kyle, she suddenly wanted to come see him. And of course, we thought nothing of it. What normal aunt wouldn't want to meet her newborn nephew? To be honest, I kind of suspected she would ask us for money to fly out here, but she never did, so I guess money was never really the issue before. But anyway, she arrived by car service about an hour ago. She seemed a little thin and withered, I guess, since I last saw her, but overall normal. She was acting normal, I mean. Kyle was sleeping in his crib upstairs, so we all had tea together down here before going to see him. The conversation over the tea was a little awkward, I guess. She was kind of vague about how she'd been spending the last few years of her life, but once we turned the conversation back to the pregnancy and the birth and everything, it all seemed perfectly natural. But then we heard Kyle start to cry on the baby monitor and figured then was as good a time as any to have Angela meet him. She took a deep breath before continuing. We went upstairs, and Kyle was still crying, so I picked him up, rocked him a little, calmed him down. Once he seemed relaxed, I asked Angela if she would like to hold him, and she said yes. She reached for him, and, ugh, it was so unsettling, so creepy. She sorts of reached for him like this, Amy demonstrated, both her arms outstretched straight with her hands turned inward, like she was holding a pot full of something unpleasant that she wanted to keep away from her nose. I figured she was just uncomfortable with babies and handed Kyle to her, expecting her to pull him in and hold him normally, like a baby. But she just kind of kept him at arm's length and kind of lifted him up, like she demonstrated again, this time angling her arms up at the shoulder by about 45 degrees. 5 seconds went by, then 10, and she just kept holding Kyle up like that. Joe and I just stared. I felt really uncomfortable. What was worse was how she was looking at him. Her face just sorts of changed. I can't put my finger on how, exactly, but 1 second her face was normal, like it had been all night, but then she started staring at Kyle hungrily, like an animal. Her whole face kind of darkened. I don't mean the color actually changed, but like shadow clung to her face in an unnatural way. Maybe it was just her expression, but she looked like a completely different person. Anyway, I was going to just wait the weirdness out and hope she put him down, say good night, go to Nevada and not come back for another 5 years, but then Kyle started crying again. I thought he must be so uncomfortable, being held up like that, so I told Angela maybe we should put him down now, and reached out to grab him from her, but then she snarled. And oh, at me, in this deep, scratchy voice, not at all like her own, and she hit me in the face with the back of her. I guess it was her right hand, while keeping Kyle suspended in air with her left. Amy pointed to her own right cheek, where a narrow cut surrounded by bruising was visible just below her eye. She hit way harder than I ever would have imagined, and of course I was completely unprepared for it, and I hit the ground, seeing stars. When I looked back up, I saw Angela and Joe struggling, each with one hand on Kyle, still being held so high off the ground. It happened so fast, I couldn't tell what was going on, but suddenly Angela was holding a knife, and then... At this point, Amy broke down again. We tried to encourage her to continue, but she was too upset to form words, and merely pointed upwards, to the ceiling. I turned towards Mike, who was standing in a corner of the room. He gestured that I come over to him. I turned toward Carter and nodded. She nodded back, confirming our unspoken understanding that I talked to Mike while she continued to comfort Amy. Mike brought me back to the entranceway, directly in front of the stairs, and explained, I think she wants you to see for yourself. Joe's body is still upstairs. He and I walked up together, and he showed me the door to the nursery where the murder had taken place. I opened the door and saw the body, surrounded by blood-soaked carpet. There were obvious knife wounds all over Joe's back, with tears through his blue flannel shirt. I have seen some messed up things in my career, some which were objectively more gruesome than this, but somehow, seeing it in a nursery just disturbed me in a way I never had felt before. Shakily, I reached for my phone and speed dialed the station. We were going to need forensics. We left the house about 45 minutes later, leaving forensics to finish analyzing the scene. Carter filled me in on what she had learned from Amy while I was upstairs. Honestly, there wasn't much. After killing Joe, Angela had fled with the baby. According to Amy, Angela had moved with inhuman speed. Amy had tried to chase after her, but Angela just moved too fast. She didn't see it, but Amy was pretty sure Angela had simply jumped down the stairs to the bottom floor, based on a noise she had heard and how quickly Angela managed to get out the door. Amy had grabbed her car keys with the intent to chase Angela down, but by the time she'd gotten to her car, Angela was out of sight, so Amy thought it more prudent to call her neighbor and the police. We showed up about 20 minutes after the event. Carter and I sat in silence in the car, too shocked to talk, or even to turn on the radio. It was pitch black out, about 11 p.m. There wasn't another soul on the road, and our high beams were blaring. My eyes were staring dead ahead, my mind subconsciously scanning my peripheral vision for deer that might jump out. About 15 minutes after leaving the house, while we were patrolling the winding roads in the woods nearby, I thought I saw an indistinct figure a quarter-mile down the road. I slowed down to let it pass, but quickly realized it wasn't a deer at all. I turned to look at my partner. "Carter, do you see?" I didn't need to finish my sentence. Carter nodded, her eyes transfixed to the road ahead, her expression dead serious. I turned back toward the road. The figure was a woman with long, sandy-colored hair, in jeans and a white tank top. In her right arm was what looked like a bundle of blankets, which she was carrying like a football. She was walking across the road, looking down, completely ignoring us. We slowed to a stop about 50 feet from her, by which time she was about 3/4 of the way across, still completely oblivious to our existence. I honked the horn, and she stopped cold, her head snapping towards the car. Her face was gaunt and haggard, her eyes cold, her teeth bared like a dog. Even with the high beams centered on her, much of her face was cast in shadow. She turned to face the car, making indistinct barking noises and swinging her free hand threateningly toward us, as if she was trying to scare us away. Her fingernails were long and sharp, clearly visible despite the distance between us. I turned back to Carter. "I'll handle this. You slide into the driver's seat in case we need to get out of here fast." She nodded in agreement and unbuckled her seatbelt. I did the same and opened the driver's side door, hopping out as Carter started to step over the transmission. "Ma'am, you're going to need to come with me," I called out to the figure, who continued barking and swinging her arm. Now that I was outside, I could hear a baby crying from her general direction. "Ma'am, you need to stop swinging your arm. We're the police. We're placing you under arrest, Dash." In a sudden, fluid motion, the woman reached behind her back and pulled out a blood-stained knife. She began taking very deliberate steps toward me. I drew my handgun. The last thing I wanted to do was fire on someone who was carrying an infant, but by this point I was genuinely scared for my life. "Ma'am, drop that knife and stop moving. Drop that knife and stop moving, right now." She was moving faster, erasing half the distance between us in a matter of seconds. I fired, twice, both into her left leg. She stopped only for a moment before continuing toward me, now sprinting despite her injuries. At such close range I was able to easily hit her again, this time in the left chest, with no real fear of hitting the baby. This time she crumpled to the floor, just a yard or two from me. She released the baby on the way down, who fell almost at my feet. I reached down and picked him up. He was bawling his eyes out, but seemed uninjured. In my rush to return the infant to the relative safety of the police car, I broke one of the cardinal rules of police training, namely, don't turn your back on an armed hostile, no matter how dead you think they are until you're absolutely sure. I had only taken a few steps back towards the cruiser when I heard an unearthly roar from behind. I turned to see the woman, Angela, inexplicably back on her feet, her face contorted with rage, knife in hand. My gun was back in its holster, and I was holding Kyle in my dominant hand. She was 2 long strides away from striking distance. Suddenly, I heard the revving of the car engine and saw Carter slam the cruiser into the woman, who was knocked back into the ground. She immediately started trying to stand back up. I heard Carter yell, "Get in," from inside the car. I didn't have to be told twice. I threw open the passenger door on the driver's side and jumped in, baby safely cuddled against my chest. No sooner had I slammed the door behind me than did Carter take off. As we drove, I watched in the rearview mirror as Angela made it to her feet and began chasing after us. My eyes darted back and forth between the mirror and the speedometer, 10, 20, 30 miles an hour, and somehow, she was still keeping pace with us, eyes wild, teeth gnashing. It was only upon reaching 40 miles per hour that we finally pulled ahead, leaving her to be swallowed by the darkness of the night. It was a long and exhausting night. Amy was called immediately. She came down to the station and Kyle was returned to her. She was happy, of course, but also terrified and refused to leave the station for fear of Angela's return. Frankly, after seeing what I had seen, I couldn't blame her and recommended to the chief that she stay overnight at the station. The entire police force spent that night patrolling the woods near where we had seen Angela, now armed with heavier weapons and accompanied by dogs. When dawn broke, the woods were searched. Nobody took any breaks except for a few hours of sleep here and there for a good week after the incident, but Angela was never found. Amy refused to return to her home with Angela still at large, and she ended up flying across the country to Florida to live with her parents. I communicate with her by email periodically. The incident freaked me out so much that I couldn't rest easy without knowing for sure that she was okay. As of last week, she and Kyle were both fine. We tried to research what we could about Angela. She had spent the last few years in an area of Nevada known for being home to a number of cults. Most of these were just money-making schemes for their leaders, but a few had been linked to criminal activity in the past. Little was known about these cults, because whenever a suspect belonging to one was apprehended, they always either escaped or, more commonly, died under mysterious circumstances. However, it was widely believed by the locals that the cultists would conduct rituals using the blood of innocent people in exchange for supernatural powers. The locals were therefore extremely protective of their children, which were thought to be the most valuable to the cultists because of their purity. In March, my partner, Jane Carter, left the force on maternity leave as she was getting uncomfortably big. I was reassigned to work with Officer Andre Henderson. I jokingly complained about the situation to her, but I of course was really very happy that she'd be safe in her own home, raising her new baby away from all the craziness of the world. Today, April 5th, 2018, I was called into the chief's office about something urgent. I expected to be reprimanded for some minor breach of protocol, but when I walked in, his face was ashen, his expression vacant. He tried to tell me what was wrong but couldn't get the words out. He simply handed me a slip of paper, a transcript from dispatch. Mr. Sam Carter had called in at 9 a.m. the morning after returning from an overnight shift at the hospital where he worked. He found his wife, Jane Carter, dead in bed. Her abdomen had been cut open and her unborn baby removed. A bloody knife was found next to the body. The location of the perpetrator and baby was still unknown. I was walking home one night last year. My neighborhood isn't particularly well lit, but there is a single street light on the dirt road. That night, as I approached it on my way home, I saw another figure coming my way. As we got closer, I saw it was a homeless man. In the dark, I could see he was short, had a large backpack, and was wearing what looked like a filthy poncho. As we passed each other, he looked at me and stopped. "Peter," the man gasped. I thought I heard fear in his voice. "I'm Hispanic, short and stocky, about 5'4", and I have a beard. Basically, I look like a construction worker." He probably should have called me Pedro. "Nope," I said as I continued walking. "Not Peter." As I started to pass him, though, he shot out a dark, hairy arm. "No," he said after a moment, "you are not. Your voice is different. But you seem to me the exact likeness of Peter. Here, let me look at you." And before I could say anything, he stepped into the light. At first, I thought he was Hispanic like me, but when I saw his distinguished nose and thick brow, I realized he was Middle Eastern. He was about 2 or 3 inches shorter than me, which is saying something, and he was thin. His long, woolly hair was filthy and looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks, and his beard was stringy and patchy. But it was his complexion that impressed me, because it was immensely dark. I don't mean that he had skin like a black person, but that there was a pallor of sickliness that made his skin look far darker, deader than it naturally should have. "You are not the exact likeness I thought," the man said to me after a few moments. "Your nose is thinner. And your eyes, you do not have the light behind them that Peter had." "Good to know," I said politely. I didn't want to talk to him anymore, so I started to leave. "Wait," the man said, grabbing my arm. "Please, tarry with me for a few minutes. If you do, I promise you money." I'd never heard a homeless person offer money. And he didn't talk like a homeless person. He had an accent, and his manner of speech seemed either educated or old-fashioned. I could have probably overpowered him, if necessary, too. I was intrigued, so I agreed. I got comfortable, leaning against the streetlight, and we talked for a few minutes about the weather and other mundane things. "Are you a religious man?" he asked after a bit. "I grew up Catholic," I said, "but I believe in rational thought and reality." The man laughed, but it was mirthless. "You say rational thought and reality as if they're the same," he said, "but it has been my experience that reality seldom cares what a man thinks is rational." "Is that so?" I said. "A man's reasoning is only as good as his vision," he continued. "What he has seen, where he is standing, and where he decides to keep his eyes. I guess. I'll prove it to you," he said. "Young man, would you like to know my name?" "Sure," I shrugged. The man smiled, showing broken teeth. "I am the one known today as Judas Iscariot," he said, "who walked with Jesus Christ in Galilee." And here we go, I thought. Is that right? I smiled. "You don't believe me, of course," he said. "Nope," I said curtly. "Judas died when he hanged himself, and his bowels fell out. Yes, I hanged myself. But," and now he spoke in a softer voice, "by that time I had lost the privilege of death." The man was too well-spoken to be your garden-variety crazy homeless person, and there was intelligence in his eyes. He was clearly messing with me. My natural argumentativeness came out. "But," I said, "Judas was buried in, what's it called?" "The Potter's Field," he finished. "Or Field of Blood." "Yes, they buried me there, but I was not dead when they did it. See for yourself." He lifted up his poncho, and I reeled back. To my absolute horror, the man had no abdomen. Right below his rib cage was a cavity, a thin layer of heavily scarred skin, which I assumed had once covered his entrails, stretched so far back that it reached the outline of his spine, which I could have reached out and touched. Where there should have been a stomach, intestines, all those things necessary for being alive, there was only space. As I looked up to meet the man's eyes, though, they weren't there, because his head now swung at an angle upon his chest, his neck broken. I jumped back. The man laughed, fixing his head with a sickening crack. "Don't feel too bad," he said. "Reason is crucial, but it's only as good as what reality has chanced to show you." For a few moments, I couldn't speak. This man should have been dead, but here he was, standing and talking with me. How are you did you make a deal with the devil?" I blurted. I wasn't used to thinking metaphysically, and it was the only thing that came to mind. He chuckled softly. "No, I already told you that I lost the privilege to die. Some people think I made a covenant with Satan before everything happened. I did not, but you do not need to. He can destroy you just the same if you're not careful. Is that what happened when you betrayed?" I stopped myself. It seemed rude. The man looked at the ground. "I lost track of where I was keeping my eyes," said the man sadly. For the first time, I felt pity for him. He talked for a good half an hour, and I listened. He described his old home, his family, and the other disciples. Whenever it felt that he should have mentioned Christ, however, his story became suddenly vague, and he left out lots of details he clearly didn't want to talk about it. After a while, I realized that the man only ever described events in terms of before and after. It was easy to guess what frame of reference he was using. I can't relate everything he said here, but it was a lot. "Are you the only one?" I asked when he was finished. "An ancient person that's still around?" "Very few do something to deserve this," he said. "But there is at least one more that still walks the earth. He's the one that has come to be known as Cain." The man shuddered. "I do not wish to meet him again. Cain made dark covenants, and he has the same anger and hatred as his master. But Cain is mightier." "Cain is mightier than Satan?" I said. "Really?" "Do not be impressed," he cautioned. "Anybody that has a body is mightier than the old serpent, but not smarter. He can lead you to your destruction as easily as a lamb to a butcher. I've only ever met one man who was smarter than Satan, and I was his disciple." The man looked like he was going to say more, but he seemed to stop himself. "I've got another question," I said. "You said you lost the privilege to die. How is dying a privilege?" The man chuckled again. "Oh, how many things have been lost," he said. "Without death you are damned, for when your time on this earth is over, death is a gate to progress to the final glory. Damned, another word for stopped, or unable to progress. Progress to the final glory? You mean, to heaven?" Again, he chuckled. "Heaven is not the final glory, at least, if you do things right." "There's something better than being in heaven?" "Yes," he said. "Take a guess." After a few moments, I had to admit I was stumped. I couldn't think of anything better than heaven. The man smiled again. "The final glory," he said, "is Godhood." It took me a moment to process what he said. "So you're saying that it is possible to become a god, like our God?" "Yes." After a moment of being stunned, my mind was flooded with questions. "Will we all become gods?" I asked. "I doubt it," the man said. "Everyone on earth has the capacity, but do not suppose for an instant that God will bestow ultimate knowledge and power to children that have proved they won't be good. Could you imagine omnipotence and omniscience given to people that haven't developed temperance, love, and justice? The universe would be chaos. So if we can become gods, I reasoned, is that how?" "Yes, very good. That is how God became God. Once, in another world, he was a man just like you, son to his own father. He lived righteously, died, was resurrected, and was bestowed with godhood." "This seems too much," I said. "Oh," the man said. "Think, man. What is the purpose of our coming to this earth? Do you suppose there simply wasn't enough room in heaven? We came down to prove ourselves worthy of godhood, for who would act badly in front of God save Satan and his followers? And tell me, why do you suppose there is pain and evil in this world if God really is both all-loving and all-powerful? Well, how can you prove yourself worthy if there is nothing to prove yourself against?" I was silent for a few moments. "That still leaves me with some very serious questions," I said. "Unfortunately, I cannot be the man to tell you more," he said, and he picked up his backpack from the ground. "In fact, I have left out the most crucial parts. I have lost all rights to actual ministry, and I have probably said more than I should have. You will have to search for the answers to those questions by yourself. But I promise that if you search well," and here he smiled sadly, showing his broken teeth, "you will find the answers." "That's not fair," I said. I desperately wanted to know more. Perhaps you're right, he said, putting on his backpack. Maybe I should not have said so much. After all, why should you trust the man who betrayed Jesus Christ? I thought about that. But there had been something in the way that he had spoken, something about his absolute plainness, and the way his dark eyes had, for a brief moment, shimmered. I did not feel that he was lying. I promised you money, he said, extending his hand to me. Take this. He handed me what appeared to be a quarter. I've been trying to pay for my actions for almost 2,000 years, he said. Maybe our conversation will be a stone removed from my dam. I don't deserve forgiveness, of course, but then again, nobody actually does. And yet he gives it anyway. I looked briefly down at the coin he had given me. When I looked up again, however, the man had disappeared completely. I was now alone under the streetlight. I examined the coin more closely and gasped. It wasn't a quarter. I later showed the coin to my friends and family, though nobody would believe my story. It was a single piece of silver. For days after my encounter, my head spun with questions. I wanted to see Judas again. The things we talked about had made me feel a sort of hunger in my soul, and I wanted more. So I started volunteering at a homeless shelter, hoping he would show up. He was homeless, after all, wasn't he? I spent every free moment at the local soup kitchen. I cleaned the dishes in the kitchen, I prepared the food, I served it to the people there, all the time keeping my eyes peeled for a short, dark man with messy hair, broken teeth, and a dirty poncho. But he didn't show up. By the third week, I started losing hope of seeing Judas again. By the fourth week, I had given up hope entirely, but I wasn't thinking about that. You see, I had forgotten my reason for volunteering and was simply enjoying the work. At first I hadn't even paid attention to the people I was serving food to. I was too busy looking over their shoulders, trying to catch a glimpse of a filthy poncho. But as I had lost hope of seeing Judas, I started paying attention to the people in front of me. I started watching them, and I started talking with them. There was two serving Stephen, a man with thick glasses who constantly tried to get more food than the other people. He always talked about Watergate with me, and when there was enough food to spare and no one else around to care, I would sneak him an extra orange or pudding. Then there was Katie, a 30-something suffering from drug addiction that hadn't seen her kids in 2 years. We talked a lot. And Fat won. I'm not being rude, it's what he called himself. He was the jolliest man you'd ever want to meet, constantly flashing toothless grins, and his gut was so enormous that it hung literally 10 inches over his belt, and of course his pants never stayed all the way up. As I spent time with them, I grew to love these people. Sometimes I would feel reluctant about going to the kitchen. I might feel that I'd rather read or watch movies or something, but not once did I regret it after I got there. One late afternoon, I was the last one at the shelter. I had my own keys by that time, and it was my turn to lock up. I was sweeping up in the kitchen when I heard the front door open. "I'm sorry, we're closed," I called out. After a moment, however, a person entered the kitchen. It was Judas. I dropped the broom and immediately hugged him. I don't know if it was appropriate, but I was happy to see him, and he smiled. I offered him a bagged sandwich from the counter, but he held up his hand. "I don't have the stomach for it," he smiled, glancing towards his abdomen. And then I remembered the man had no organs south of his sternum. I was an idiot. I had been searching in a soup kitchen for a man that didn't have a stomach. Welp. We pulled up 2 chairs in the main room. Judas looked exactly the same he had as before, though his hair might have been even a bit dirtier. "I saw you come in here earlier," he said. "Can I guess you were looking for me?" I confirmed his suspicion. We made small talk for a few minutes, and I helped myself to the sandwich. He asked how I had been, and I told him about the last few weeks. "I have so many questions for you," I said after finishing the sandwich. I am sorry, he shook his head, but I can't be the one to tell you the most important things. You said that last time, I said. I don't understand why. Because I no longer have that right, Judas replied. When it comes to the most precious truths, the deliverer has to have the authority to deliver them. I wanted to press him, but there was a finality in his voice that told me he would not budge. You should be easier on yourself, I said after a moment. I beg your pardon? I did some reading, I explained, about Christ's death. He had to die. Yes, said Judas. He was looking at me quizzically. So you should be easier on yourself, I said. It all had to happen like that. Suddenly, the man's brow grew furrowed. It did not have to happen like that, he said, slamming his fist on his leg. I was taken aback, but he continued. Of course there were other ways. Do you suppose I was foreordained to sin? No, light does not mingle with darkness. Or do you suppose that I was a puppet of fate, robbed of my will? No. I was tempted by Satan, and I heeded. But there were prophecies, I started. Prophecies. And do you know what prophecies are? They are knowledge of truth and nothing more. They exist because of our actions, not the other way around. I had sons, and I knew them. I knew what things would cause them to stumble. But was it my knowledge of my sons that caused them to stumble? No. And do you suppose that God's knowledge of our weaknesses dooms us? No. They are our weaknesses and ours alone, and it's a devil that tries to tell you otherwise. For a few moments, we sat in silence. I'm sorry, I said quietly. He looked at me, and his dark eyes were calm again. No, he said, putting his hand to his forehead. I am sorry, friend. You meant well, and I should not have raised my voice. But true change means not excusing your sins in the least, and resisting all urges to do so. So I humbly ask you, please do not give me opportunities to excuse my sins. I do not need them. He put his hand gently on my shoulder. I agreed. He called me a devil once, Judas said, looking at the ground. And it was true. I was. Well, he called Peter Satan once, I offered. I remember that occasion, he said. Tell me, do you know what the word Satan means? I admitted I didn't. It means adversary. When Peter tried to persuade Christ, even in goodwill, that he did not have to take the very difficult path that he was born for, Peter momentarily made himself Christ's adversary. And Christ did not need that temptation. Oh, right, I said, Satan isn't the devil's real name. It was Lucifer. I now realize I wasn't staying on subject, but Judas was kind. Wrong again, my eager friend, Judas smiled. Lucifer is another title, it means bearer of light. And so he was, just as many who bear truth, light, may be Lucifers. But he changed that when he started the war in heaven. A war in heaven? It was a schism, he said, between those who chose to pursue Godhood in the way that Father had outlined, and the angry ones that wanted to achieve Godhood on their own terms, which is actually impossible. But anger seldom cares about what is possible. They knew what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. The war ultimately divided the ones who got bodies from the ones who decided to separate themselves from the light. He looked solemn. Separation from light is death of the spirit, he said softly. Your spirit still exists, of course, but there is no joy. There is no real happiness. Only lies, anger, and suffering. I wonder what it would have been like to be there during the war, I said. Judas chuckled. You were there before you were born here. You had another name. You lived there for what we would measure as thousands of years, though I'm not sure we measured it the same there. Everybody that has come to earth, and everybody that lived in heaven and was present for the war, And since you have a body, you can know which side you chose. We spoke for a little while longer, mostly along those lines. Eventually, however, the light in the windows grew dark, and we knew the sun was setting. Judas said he had already spent enough time, and then he had to go. We locked up the soup kitchen, I hugged him outside the door, and we parted ways. I only lived about a half-mile from the soup kitchen, so I walked home. When I wanted to get there quickly, I would cut through the woods behind my apartment building, and so it was that night. The sun was still setting, and there was just enough light to make my way through the trees. I was probably about 100 yards from my apartment when I saw a light. It started from behind me. I only noticed it when my shadow grew long. I turned and saw what I can only describe as a ball of light growing in brightness. After a few moments, I realized that there was a figure within the light. It was an angel. He had flowing, white hair that reached to his shoulders, his ornate white robe had the most intricate, otherworldly designs, and the sash around his waist had what appeared to be a type of writing, which I didn't know the meaning of. The angel called me by my name. Rejoice, the angel smiled. You have been chosen to receive great truths. It took me a moment to process what he was saying, but as soon as I did, I felt excitement up and down my spine. I'm listening, I said. The angel smiled again. I come bearing knowledge that will set you free. And with this freedom, you can find happiness, and you should share this knowledge with everyone you know, so that they may be free also. And what knowledge is that? That. Wait, came a voice. I turned my head, a small figure came out from behind the tree, and I saw that it was Judas. Come here, Judas, I said excitedly. Come talk with us. Get thee hence, Satan, said Judas to the angel. Do not heed the sinner, said the angel to me, rolling his eyes. He would lead you into false service, but rejoice, for you may lift up your head and be free. Get thee hence, Satan, Judas repeated. The angel turned to Judas. And by what authority do you command me? The angel said. I almost thought I heard the hint of a sneer. Judas paused for a second. He looked unsure. Then, he said something. He said it so softly, almost under his breath, that I did not hear it. Suddenly, my ears were filled with a terrible scream. I had to cover my ears. I thought my eardrums would burst. The trees seemed to shake, as if we were in a tornado, and suddenly, all around me was darkness, spreading out like a mist. The cry grew even louder, and the angel no longer looked angelic. His face was contorted as he wailed, and his eyes seemed like black holes, until the darkness completely overtook my vision. I was knocked to my knees. I thought the darkness would consume me. Then, in an instant, it all ended, and the angel was gone. After a moment, I realized I was on my back, and I felt immensely weak. I could see the calm night sky above me. Soon, Judas leaned over me. What did you do? I managed to ask. Something I perhaps did not have the authority to do. But it is done. He extended his hand and helped me up. I had a feeling I needed to follow you. Now I know why. Satan can turn himself into an angel of light, a shadow of his former self, if not more ornate. Didn't know that, was all I could mutter. If you see an angel again, said Judas, putting my arm over his shoulder, tell them to shake your hand. A true angel is either a resurrected being, so you'll feel their hand, or they're awaiting resurrection and don't have a body, so they won't try to shake your hand. But Satan and his followers, they just can't resist trying to deceive. If you go to shake the angel's hand and you feel nothing, you can know it's the adversary. Here, let's get you home. He promised me freedom, I said as Judas helped me walk. That's what he promises everybody, said Judas. It's his favorite irony. We walked in silence for several minutes. Eventually, we reached my apartment, where Judas propped me up as I unlocked the front door. "He hates you, you know," he said, "since you're trying to find truth. Were it in his power, he would destroy you, body and soul, until nothing of you remained." "That's terrifying to know," I said, opening the door. Judas chuckled. "It just means you're on the right path." I bid Judas good night for the second time. "I will probably see you again," said Judas. "But in the meantime, be wary. I fear there is more yet to come." And he left. I saw Judas about 2 weeks later. We walked in the forest behind my apartment, and he answered questions I asked him, at least the ones he agreed to answer. After a while, we eventually reached a small lake where my friends and I occasionally went fishing. "I used to be the best at skipping stones," he said, looking out across the lake. We spent a good 15 minutes skipping rocks. It didn't take Judas long to warm up, because before long the stones he threw would regularly get 6, 7, and even 8 skips across the lake's surface. "Can I say something?" I asked after he had managed to get a stone almost completely to the other side of the lake. "Sure," he said. "I've been thinking," I said. "I know you don't make excuses for yourself, but I think you have to forgive yourself." "I don't think that's the same as excusing yourself. I mean, how can you become a new person if you don't let the old one go?" For a moment Judas looked surprised, but then he creased his eyebrows and shrugged. "Perhaps you're right," he said. "Could you do that?" I asked. "I could try," he said, looking at the trees. For a while, we didn't talk. "I think there's something else you need," I added after a few minutes. "And what is that, my friend?" "A shower, man. You smell horrible." "Oh." We walked back to my apartment, and I let Judas use my bathroom. Of course, he knew how to use a shower. He'd been around long enough, and I provided him with a pair of grooming scissors before shutting him in. Even though he was shorter and thinner than me, we were similar enough in clothes size, so while he showered, I replaced his dirty clothes with a nice white t-shirt I had recently bought and a pair of comfortable, broken-in jeans. I took away his ragged tennis shoes and replaced them with a pair of my sturdier boots that would definitely last longer. For good measure, I found him a hat. Judas exited the shower, dressed himself, and went back to the bathroom to groom himself. When he came out, his beard was neat, and his hair was shorter and cleaner. He still had the pallor of someone who had been homeless for a very long time, but he looked much better. I even offered him a new poncho, a gift from my grandmother a few years ago. "I'm Mexican, remember?" "Thank you," he said after looking at himself in the mirror. "I don't even recognize myself." "It's all good," I said. "You can repay me by answering some more questions I have." "Fair enough," he said. I asked if we could go for another walk through the forest, and Judas agreed. There was something about being out in nature that made our conversations feel sublime, somehow more real. It started to get dark about 10 minutes after we entered the forest. Judas was in the middle of answering one of my questions when suddenly he reached out an arm and stopped me. "Something isn't right," he said, looking around. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Darkness." "It's almost night," I said. "No, that isn't what I..." But he stopped. He was now looking into the forest, and I looked where his eyes were drawn. It was a man, a huge one. The man was completely naked, though I couldn't tell at first. He was covered entirely in thick, curly body hair. Were it any thicker, he might have literally looked like a bear. He was easily 6.5 feet tall. I've seen taller men, but never a bigger or stronger one. His muscles were like boulders, not like a bodybuilder, whose muscles are mostly for show, but immensely thick and sinewy, and even his thighs were bigger than a man's head. He looked like, given enough time, he could literally rip one of the trees out of the ground with his bare arms. The unkempt hair atop his head was thick, black, and curly, and must have reached halfway down his chest. "Cain," said Judas. I felt the blood drain from my face. The man slowly grinned. His large teeth were like a row of gray tombstones, and even from the distance, he smelled horrible, like rotting flesh. "What do you want with me?" Judas called. "I'm not here for you," Cain said. Then he looked at me and grinned even wider. If I had any blood left in my face, it drained out, too. "He looks like Peter," said Cain. "What do you want with me?" I demanded. "Satan knows you know too much," Judas said quietly to me. "He doesn't want you sharing anything with lots of people that could shake his kingdom." The man's ears must have been as sharp as a dog's, because he laughed. "He said I would find him with the traitor," said Cain. "The angels don't usually let me near people, but there are never any guarding you." Judas's face grew serious. "You should never have been around me," he said to me quietly. "This is my fault." Cain took a step toward us, and I'm surprised the forest floor didn't shake. "You will not destroy this man," Judas said, extending his hand. "Not at first," smiled Cain, licking his lips. And with what seemed to be only 2 or 3 steps, Cain was right before us. Judas, however, stepped in between the towering figure and me. "Move," Cain grunted. "No," said Judas defiantly. Cain leaned down over Judas. "Very well," said Cain. "Shall I kiss your cheek before I destroy you?" "You can't kill me," said Judas. "That doesn't matter," smiled Cain, and he put his huge hand on Judas's shoulder. For a second, it seemed like time was frozen, but the spell was broken as Cain's thick brow furrowed, and his dark eyes suddenly had an evil gleam. "Run!" Judas yelled. I did what he said. From what I can tell, Cain must have flung Judas to one side, because I heard the collision of a body with the forest floor, and before I knew it, Cain was after me. I am short and stocky, and definitely not a runner, but I sprinted with everything that was in me, darting in between trees. I could hear Cain's taunting, booming voice, and I cannot, in good conscience, repeat the things that he said he would do to my body before, during, and after he killed me. I can, however, confirm that his horrible promises were not limited to just devouring my flesh. And he was gaining on me. Suddenly, Cain gave a shout, and I heard an immense crash. I risked a glance behind me. Cain had fallen face forward, and by his head there was a stone, still spinning on the ground. Almost 15 yards behind Cain's immense, prone figure, I could see Judas, his arms still outstretched. "Head for civilization," Judas yelled. It took me a moment to find my bearings, but as I hurriedly glanced through the trees, I was able to glimpse the mountains east. I had to head west for a few hundred yards, and I would reach a road. How far until I could reach a gas station or house or something? Who knew? Would that actually stop Cain? Who knew? But I ran. Now, you might consider hunting to be more of a white person thing, but I can tell you that my family has done it frequently. Which is how I know what I ran into when I was running recklessly and not watching, and why my foot instantly became tangled, and I fell. It was a net trap. They're usually meant to get deer, and I'm not even sure they're completely legal. But here one was, and my foot was tangled in one. It would have been easy enough to get out of if I had a few moments. But I looked up, and there was Cain. "I have caught you," he said. And he approached. Maybe Cain had set the trap. I don't know. All I know is that in that moment, I realized the irony that, in my entire pursuit of truth, I had never once prayed. Now seemed like a good time to start, but Cain was approaching too fast, and my brain was too frozen to even form words in my mind. With a shout, I saw a figure throw itself onto Cain, and I recognized it as Judas. At first, it didn't seem that Cain even minded. He was a mountain, and Judas was a breeze. However, Judas swung his arm towards Cain's face. Cain bellowed, and immediately threw Judas off of him. Cain began clutching his eye. As Judas got up, I could see that he was holding a jagged stone, and that it was covered in black liquid, what blood must have turned into after pumping through the same veins for thousands of years. As quick as he could, Judas put himself between me, the idiot tangled up on the forest floor, and Cain. Still clutching his eye, Cain made to grab Judas, but Judas's hand was too quick, and he fended Cain off with the stone, delivering a few cuts to the giant's arm. Cain didn't seem to mind the wounds, but he couldn't manage to grab Judas. His sudden lack of depth perception was probably not helping. Finally, Cain stood up properly. He sighed and delivered an earth-shattering punch to Judas's face. Judas was knocked down to the ground with more than just the force of gravity. He fell before me in a heap, and for a moment he stayed down. "Will you not yield now, traitor?" Cain bellowed. Slowly, Judas stirred and began to rise. I looked into his eyes as he began to get up. Cain must have hooked Judas in the left cheek, because Judas's jaw now hung completely askew on the right side of his face. But this didn't stop Judas. Slowly, but shakily, he rose to his feet and stood defiantly before Cain, a thin, 5-foot-tall man against a giant monster. Cain lowered his hand from his eye. Black goo was streaming down his face. His remaining eye glared at Judas, and with one swift motion, he delivered a punch that could have stopped a semi-truck directly into Judas's chest. Judas was knocked back against me, and he didn't move. Cain laughed. "You do not need to be dead for destruction," he cackled. And he looked at me, and laughed even harder. He began approaching me. Suddenly, an amazing light began to grow in between Cain and me. The light from Satan's visitation had been immensely bright, like someone had shone a spotlight into my eyes. This light, though, it was different. I struggled to describe it, but this light almost seemed tangible, like I could have reached out and felt it between my fingers. I would not have been surprised if this was an angel. And sure enough, after a moment, an angel appeared. This one looked much different than Satan had. While Satan's robes had been intricate and covered in ornate designs, this one's white robes were simple. "Get thee hence, Cain," said the angel in a booming voice, "and never return to molest this man." I was surprised when Cain immediately fled, and as I watched him disappear into the darkness, I had to wonder what the angels did when Cain attempted to refuse their orders. In a few seconds, Cain was nowhere to be seen. Then I looked down at Judas, who I held in my arms. In movies, people always get to cradle the dying person in their arms, maybe exchange some heartfelt dialogue. I didn't get that. As soon as looked, I instantly knew that Judas was no longer there. It was just his body. His chest was completely caved in, and his white shirt now had a scarlet flower of blood that reached almost to his back. "Do not fear," the angel said to me. "You will not see Cain again, as long as you are righteous." "Shake my hand," I said, stretching out my arm. I had not forgotten Satan's attempt to cheat me, nor Judas's subsequent advice. The angel reached out and shook my hand, and I felt his strong grip. "You were watching Judas," I said shakily. "Of course we were," he said. "All penitent souls are watched after. But we were ordered to allow this." "Why?" I demanded. "Because," smiled the angel, "it is finally time for Judas to rest and progress." My natural argumentativeness almost came out, but in an instant, any sort of anger or resentment was gone. "He has a wife and children who have been waiting very patiently on the other side to see him again," the angel continued, "and some other friends who will welcome him back with open arms. They've had some time to forgive him." "But why like this?" I asked. "Judas betrayed a man that was willing to lay down his life for his friends," said the angel. But now, Judas has laid down his life for his friend. I can promise you, Judas would have refused it any other way. I laughed a little. I had to agree with that. Lay Judas's body to rest here in the forest, the angel commanded. Use the shovel and blanket in the back of your truck and bury it out by the lake. And the angel began to fade away. Wait, I said. I still have questions. Seek, and ye shall find, the angel said. Soon, the light was gone, and I was left alone in the forest with the remains of my friend. And so I buried his body by the lake. I marked it with a huge stone, and I said a few words after. I don't know if Judas was listening. I wouldn't be mad if he wasn't, since he was probably too busy on the other side. I still visit the stone sometimes when I have questions, and I look over the lake and skip a few stones. True gentlemen drink their scotch at room temperature. My ears rang slightly from the lively chatter as I slid a $10 bill and my now empty glass across the bar. Another, please, I muttered. No ice. Thanks, pal. Keep the change. I rubbed my hand lightly over the grizzled 5 o'clock shadow coloring my cheeks and chin, and grimaced as the jukebox started blaring another song about jilted lovers and pickup trucks. Gulping down the last of the amber liquid, my joints creaked into movement, and I staggered my way to the door, stepping into the cool night air. You always hated the way scotch tasted on my tongue, like regret and more movies. You'd laugh as you pushed me away. I scowled, fighting the memory of your disappointed smile, and fumbled in my coat pocket until I found my keys. I knew I was in no condition to drive, but it was only 4 miles to my apartment, and at this point, what did I have left to lose? I'd gone less than 3 blocks when I remembered the half-empty bottle stashed under the passenger seat. Gripping the steering wheel in my left hand, I leaned over and groped blindly until my fingertips grazed its neck and tried to tug it loose. In what must have been only a split second but felt like a cliché movie scene slow-motion haze, the bottle that would destroy my life came free with a hard yank. Something heavy and alarmingly soft slammed into the hood of my car before sliding under my tires with a muffled thump. My head pounded into the steering wheel, and glass rained down on my wilting form like a meteor shower before the entirety of the cosmos were snuffed out. I woke up to someone gingerly shaking my shoulder. Mister. Hey, mister. You okay? Lifting my throbbing head, I wiped some blood away from my eye and examined the source of the voice. There was a girl, no more than 16, a tiny waif with cornflower blue eyes peering hesitantly out from behind messy strawberry blonde bangs. She laughed uncomfortably. You sure killed the heck out of that deer, mister. Your truck's pretty messed up too. Are you all right? Your head's bleeding awfully bad. I climbed shakily out, legs wobbling under me as I thought briefly to myself how the deer I'd apparently killed must have tottered about like this as a fawn before my knees gave out and I collapsed back into unconsciousness. 2 days later, I was at home with 19 stitches above my eyebrow and another 13 crossing my jaw, a crumpled mockery of what used to be a truck riding away in my front yard, and one of the worst cravings for booze I'd ever known. As I glowered at the photos of a couple in happier times taunting me from the coffee table, I knew it wasn't merely a craving anymore. It was a need, gnawing at me with more bite than the pain of my injuries. I threw on my coat and shoes and prepared to walk to the nearest gas station. Whoa, the girl cried out, disheveled bangs puffing off her face briefly as she stood up quickly, startled by the door opening. Hey, mister. You're okay. Gosh, I was real worried, you know. I mean, with you passing out like that, and you wouldn't wake up. Gee, I sure am sorry about your truck. I guess the deer killed it too, huh? That's the only way I could find your house. I've been looking all over for you to make sure you were all right. I must have walked over 10 miles going every direction trying to find you." She stopped talking suddenly, leaning closer to study my sullen expression. "You sure you're okay?" "Got a bunch of stitches." "I'm fine," I grumbled. "What are you doing here?" "Gosh, I just said I wanted to check on you. Maybe that crash affected your hearing too." "Well, like I said, I'm fine." Seeing her face fall made me soften my tone slightly. "How long were you waiting out here for anyway?" Looking almost embarrassed, she murmured, "Couple hours, I guess." "I knocked, but you didn't answer, so I decided to wait." "I don't know, mister. I just felt like I needed to see you again." "Where you heading?" "Can I come too? Please?" Despite my loud sigh, I was relieved to have company other than my own thoughts, and we set off toward the store. After that, it became routine. Every day I sank further into the writhing tendrils of depression grasping me, retreating more into my self-imposed ostracism from the world. Every day I left to drink away my unemployment money by seeking solace in another bottle, and would find Natalie, or Nat, as she preferred to be called, waiting on my doorstep. Some days my teasing that her name was actually Nat because she was always incessantly buzzing around me was warm and lighthearted. Most days it wasn't. She stuck around anyway, and despite my best efforts to the contrary, an odd friendship formed. Nat said her parents were both in jail, and she'd been living with an elderly senile aunt who had no idea who she was half the time, much less whether or not she was attending school. I tried encouraging her to go initially, then resorted to screaming at her to leave me alone and go do something useful with her time instead, make something of herself so she wouldn't be like me or her parents, but she refused. Instead, she brought over books, maps, and puzzles. She'd sit on my dull, splintering wood floor and gaze up at me from under those darn bangs, eyes glittering as she eagerly recited the newest thing she'd learned. It was the only time her words didn't make her sound like a country bumpkin, to be frank. Did you know that the biggest earthquake ever, the 1960 Valdivia, Chile earthquake, registered as a 9.5 and was felt all the way in both Japan and New Zealand? Did you know that over 1,800,000 people were used in Jonas Salk's initial polio vaccine trials before they even knew if it would work? Between bursts of Jeopardy-like facts, she'd often ask me questions, ranging from the broad but bizarre, "What's the earliest memory you have where you were forming a memory? How many memories do you think you've forgotten?" to the pointlessly philosophical, "Do you think trees feel pain?" while I tried to drown out her chatter one drink at a time. This went on for weeks until one day her demeanor changed. She wasn't her normal bubbly self and barely spoke, though she kept looking up at me from under those bangs while reading. "What?" I finally snapped. "What? Why do you keep staring at me? Why are you acting like a puppy who got smacked with a newspaper?" I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to," she stammered quietly before sighing and starting again. "David," she asked nervously, "do you believe in heaven? Or an afterlife?" "Nope. Not since the day my dad hit me in the face with a wrench so hard it shattered 3 of my teeth, and my mom told me sometimes things happen that we don't understand, but that I must have needed to learn a lesson. I figure if there is some divine being out there." I rolled my eyes deeply as I took another drink. "They're a jerk." Nat's eyes met mine briefly, filled with what looked like regret and pity, then darted away. "So what do you think happens after we die?" With a sharp breath in, I belted off key, "The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out, the worms play pinochle on your snout." "Stop. Just stop," she cried, clenching and unclenching her pale hands into fists. I couldn't help but think of the time I saw a butterfly with a torn wing trying to fly, flapping earnestly and gracelessly with all its might before collapsing on the ground. "I know you like to be mean to me, and that's okay. Well, it's not okay, but I know that's just how you are, and I try to be understanding of that." But this is important. I need you to know something. Trying and failing to smooth her hair into place, she looked up at me. What do you think happened to the deer you hit that night? What? I don't know. I assumed someone came and moved the body or something ate it while I was in the hospital. What does that have to do with anything? Where's all this coming from? Biting her lips softly, she shook her head slowly. What if I told you there wasn't a deer? I stood up rapidly, then stayed still for a moment. My head was throbbing. Too much booze, not enough water or food. I don't know what the heck you're talking about, but you sound like a goddamn lunatic. You should go. Get your stuff. Nellie stubbornly continued to sit on the floor. There was no deer. I have nowhere to go. Where do you think I came from anyway? How do you think I'm able to hang out with you every day, with no one ever coming to look for me? Seeing my expression rapidly spiraling between confusion and anger, she began to talk faster. Think about it, David. Don't you think someone would have wondered why I'm never in school? Or for that matter, why there's a teenage girl hanging out with a man twice their age every day? My head was swimming and I felt nauseous, but a realization suddenly broke through the fog. Why are you talking so differently, Natalie? A faint sad smile crossed her face. Listen to me please, Dave. Please. I'm not crazy or stupid. Please. I sank back onto the couch. That night, you were so drunk and so bitter toward the universe, you weren't paying attention to anything but trying to get more alcohol down your throat as quickly as you could to black out into oblivion again. She inhaled and continued, voice trembling. There is no oblivion. We don't rot. We become something greater than you could ever imagine. You did hit something that night, but it wasn't a deer. I was out for a walk, trying to get away from my house and watching my aunt slowly morph into a shambling shadow of who she used to be. I saw your truck coming, speeding way too fast and swerving. I tried to get out of the way, but I couldn't. Tears welled up in her eyes. I couldn't. No, I groaned, burying my face in my palms. What are you talking about? You were fine. You were talking to me. You told me about the deer. A thought struck me, and I clung to it with the desperation of a drowning man. No, if I hit you, I'd be in jail. You're losing your mind like your aunt, that's all. This is some kind of delusional episode. Like a dam breaking, tears cascaded down her cheeks. There was no one to arrest. By the time the police got there, you were gone. Stop. Please stop. Why are you doing this? I was there. You told me what happened, and then I passed out and I woke up in the hospital, and then you started coming by all the time, all the time. Why are you here all the time, Nat? I don't understand any of this. Scooting closer to me, she pulled my hand into hers. You killed us both that night. It's okay. I know you didn't mean to. I forgave you the moment it happened. But I've been trying so hard to help you, to make you look at the universe differently, to accept what I knew as soon as it happened. That there's something better, something more. Somewhere where you don't have to drink every day, where every memory isn't filled with poison and pain. You just have to be open to it. I began weeping openly, heaving with sobs in the unabashed fashion reserved solely for toddlers and those beyond caring what others thought of them. No, no. I searched my memories in a panic, trying to recall talking to anyone else recently while buying liquor or going to the store. Wait. When was the last time I even went to the store? Or ate? I'd gotten so used to barely eating after Lizzie left that it had been ages since I felt hungry. I tried frantically to think back to my time in the hospital, to any concrete interactions with anyone there. Nothing. No, Natalie, you're the only person in my life who ever believed in me, who didn't think I was a complete piece of garbage. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have been so mean to you. You were the only friend I had. Please don't leave me. I didn't mean to hurt you, I blubbered. Smiling up at me, she laughed softly. I'm not leaving you, silly. But it's time for us both to go. She stood up, blew her bangs off her forehead one last time, and held out her hand to me again. Ready? Rising once more to shaky legs, I smiled nervously back. Ready.